unaware she is a daughter of a secret trillionaire who died recently. Husband lets his mother and mistress to humiliate his wife at a Christmas party, until he sees the guest list. She stood alone at the back of the glittering ballroom while her husband's mother and mistress tore her apart in front of Manhattan's elite. Every insult, every cruel laugh, every dismissive glance was calculated to break her. Her husband said nothing, did nothing, just watched as they treated her like garbage in a designer dress. But when that envelope arrived with the final guest list, his face went white. The names on that paper would change everything. Because the woman they'd been destroying all evening wasn't who anyone thought she was. And some people were about to learn that underestimating the wrong person doesn't just cost you respect, it costs you everything. Hello my beautiful family. Welcome back to my channel. We're now at 9K beautiful family, and my mom said we'll never hit 10K this new year. I told her she's wrong, that I have a beautiful family here who believes in these stories. So before we start, prove her wrong. Subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. Let's hit 10K together and show her what this family is made of. Now, let's get back to how it all started. Clarissa Duval had always believed that kindness was currency enough, that patience would eventually pay dividends, that the world rewarded those who endured with grace. Her mother had raised her in a cramped apartment where the rent was always late, but the love was always abundant, where dinner might be modest, but dignity was never compromised. Clarissa, her mother would say, while mending a neighbor's torn coat by lamplight, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Real power doesn't shout. It waits. It watches. And when the moment comes, it doesn't ask for permission. Those words became the foundation of everything Clarissa was, the invisible scaffolding that held her upright when the world tried to bend her into something smaller, something more convenient. She learned early that being underestimated was a gift if you knew how to use it, that people revealed their true selves when they thought you weren't worth the effort of pretense. By her mid-20s, Clarissa had become a master of the unseen, her intelligence camouflaged behind modest dresses and soft-spoken responses, her capability hidden beneath a demeanor so unassuming that people forgot she was in the room even as she solved their problems, remembered their forgotten details, and kept their lives running with the kind of seamless efficiency that only becomes visible when it's gone. She kept meticulous records not because anyone asked, but because she understood that memory was power and details were weapons you stored for battles you hadn't yet been forced to fight. Her wardrobe was simple, her jewelry minimal, her presence so carefully understated that wealthy women at charity events would speak freely in front of her, as if she were furniture, their secrets spilling like wine because they genuinely believed she didn't matter enough to remember. But Clarissa remembered everything, every slight, every kindness, every moment when someone's mask slipped and she glimpsed the truth underneath. She cataloged it all with the patience of someone who understood that justice wasn't always immediate, that sometimes the most satisfying victories were the ones you waited years to claim. Have you ever been so thoroughly dismissed that people forgot you were even human, let alone listening? What would you do with all those secrets, all those moments of casual cruelty, if you suddenly had the power to make them matter? Eric Van Halen entered her life like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His smile warm and genuine in a way that made her want to believe in fairy tales again. They met at a charity gala where she was volunteering, checking coats, and directing guests with the efficient invisibility she perfected. And he noticed her in a way no one ever had. "You have the saddest smile I've ever seen," he said, catching her off guard as she hung his coat, his eyes searching hers with what seemed like authentic curiosity. Like you're constantly bracing for disappointment. She didn't know how to respond to someone actually seeing her, so she laughed it off, but he persisted, returning to the coat check 3 times that night with increasingly transparent excuses until she finally agreed to give him her number. Their courtship was a whirlwind of attention she'd never experienced. Dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices, walks through parts of the city she'd only seen from bus windows, conversations that stretched past midnight where he asked about her thoughts, her dreams, the way she saw the world. "You're different," he told her on their 4th date, his hand warm in hers as they walked through Central Park. Everyone in my world is performing all the time, playing roles they think they're supposed to play. But you're just yourself. It's like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a room full of expensive perfume. 6 months later, he proposed in a garden where the roses cost more than her entire year's salary. And when he slipped the ring on her finger, she let herself believe that maybe kindness did matter, that maybe her mother had been right about patience leading somewhere beautiful. "I want to build a life with you," Eric said. And she believed him because she desperately wanted to. Because the alternative was admitting that even love came with a price tag she couldn't afford. The Van Halen mansion sat like a monument to old money and older judgments. Its limestone facade rising above Fifth Avenue with a kind of architectural arrogance that declared its superiority to everything around it. The first time Clarissa walked through its doors as Eric's fiancée, she felt the weight of 100 years of privilege pressing down on her shoulders, every portrait of stern-faced ancestors seeming to evaluate and find her wanting. Lenora Van Halen was waiting in the drawing room, a woman whose beauty had aged into something sharp and unforgiving, her posture so perfect it seemed engineered, her smile so practiced it never quite reached her eyes. "So you're the girl," Lenora said, the word girl, landing like an insult disguised as observation. "Eric has always had such a charitable heart." The comment hung in the air, its meaning crystal clear. "You're a project. A phase. A mistake he'll outgrow once the novelty wears off." Clarissa extended her hand, keeping her voice steady even as something cold slithered down her spine. "Mrs. Van Halen, it's an honor to meet you." Lenora's handshake was brief, her fingers cool and dismissive. "We'll see," she replied, turning away before Clarissa could respond, her attention already moving to Eric, as if Clarissa had ceased to exist the moment she'd been properly catalogued and dismissed. That first dinner was an education in the subtle violence of wealth, every course a test she hadn't known she was taking, every piece of silverware a potential trap, every pause in conversation a chance for her to reveal herself as the imposter they all suspected she was. Lenora asked questions designed to expose Clarissa's humble background, her tone always polite, but her intent unmistakable. "Where did your people come from, dear? And what does your father do? And such a quaint neighborhood you grew up in. I'm sure it built character." Eric said nothing. His silence a betrayal she felt in her bones, but couldn't yet name. And by the time dessert arrived, Clarissa understood with perfect clarity that she'd married into a family that saw her not as a person, but as an intrusion, a problem to be managed until it went away. The first months of marriage were a masterclass in isolation disguised as inclusion. Clarissa tried everything to find her place in the Van Halen world, volunteering to help with the household accounts, only to be told they had people for that, offering to organize Lenora's charity events only to be assigned tasks, so menial they were clearly meant to humiliate, attempting to connect with Eric's friends only to find herself frozen out of conversations with a kind of practiced exclusion that left no fingerprints. She adapted, studying the Van Halen ecosystem like an anthropologist documenting an alien culture, noting the hierarchies and unspoken rules, the way power flowed through gesture and implication rather than direct confrontation. She learned which topics were acceptable and which were forbidden, which social circles welcomed new money and which guarded their gates with vicious determination, which smiles meant tolerance and which meant you'd just been marked for destruction. And through it all, she maintained the composure her mother had taught her, the quiet dignity that refused to crack no matter how hard they pressed. But something else was growing inside her too, something she didn't yet have a name for. It wasn't quite anger, though anger was part of it. It wasn't quite grief, though she mourned the naive girl who'd believed love conquered all. It was more like a cold, clear awareness crystallizing in her chest, a recognition that she was collecting something valuable in all this suffering. Every dismissal, every calculated slight, every moment Eric chose his mother's approval over his wife's dignity. She was building a case, though she didn't yet know what court would hear it. What would you do if the family you married treated you like an enemy in their home? Would you fight back immediately, or would you wait, watch, and prepare for a battle they didn't even know was coming? Then Vanessa appeared, and everything Clarissa had endured suddenly had a face, a name, a specific shape to its cruelty. It was at a family dinner 3 months after the wedding, and Vanessa walked in like she owned not just the room, but everyone in it. Her beauty the kind that came from good genes and better surgeons. Her confidence, so absolute it bent the space around her. "Darling," she said to Eric, kissing both his cheeks with a familiarity that made Clarissa's stomach drop. "It's been far too long." Eric's face transformed, years falling away as he grinned with a boyish enthusiasm Clarissa had never seen directed at her. "Vanessa, God, when did you get back from Paris?" Lenora was beaming, actually beaming, her usual frost melting into genuine warmth as she embraced Vanessa like the daughter she'd actually wanted. Vanessa and Eric grew up together. Lenora explained to Clarissa, the words ostensibly inclusive, but the tone making clear that Clarissa was being informed of her own irrelevance. "They were inseparable as children. We always thought." She trailed off, letting the implication hang like a noose. Vanessa's eyes finally landed on Clarissa, assessing and dismissing her in a single sweep. "You must be the wife," she said, the article that turning the word into something temporary and interchangeable. How perfectly unexpected. The dinner that followed was torture disguised as reunion. Every anecdote about Eric and Vanessa's shared past a reminder of everything Clarissa would never be. Every inside joke a door slammed at her face. Every shared glance between them a small betrayal that accumulated into something unbearable. Eric didn't notice, or worse, didn't care. He was too busy basking in Vanessa's attention, too comfortable in the familiar rhythm of their banter, too willing to let his mother and his childhood friend treat his wife like an unfortunate piece of furniture that cluttered an otherwise perfect room. After that night, Vanessa became a constant presence, her visits increasing with a boldness that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing and knew no one would stop her. She'd arrive unannounced for lunch, stay for dinner, appear at family events with the kind of ease that came from never having to earn her place. Clarissa would catch them in quiet conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room, would see Vanessa's hand linger on Eric's arm just a beat too long, would feel the way the household staff deferred to Vanessa with a respect they never showed her. "Don't be paranoid," Eric said when Clarissa finally gathered the courage to mention it, his tone dismissive in a way that made her feel crazy for noticing what was happening right in front of her. "Vanessa's like a family. You're being insecure." But Clarissa wasn't insecure. She was observant. And what she observed was a systematic campaign to erase her from her own marriage, to make her so uncomfortable, so unwelcome, so thoroughly diminished that she'd eventually leave of her own accord, and they could all pretend she'd never existed. Lenora's comments grew sharper, more pointed, each one a paper cut designed to bleed her slowly. "Such humble taste you have, dear," she'd say about Clarissa's clothing choices. Or, "I suppose not everyone grows up understanding certain social graces," or simply, repeatedly, devastatingly. How quaint. And Eric, the man who'd promised to build a life with her, said nothing. His silence was its own form of violence. Each moment he didn't defend her another brick in the wall growing between them. As autumn turned to winter and Christmas approached, Clarissa could feel something building in the mansion's gilded halls, a tension that had nothing to do with holiday preparations and everything to do with the annual Christmas Eve gala, Lenora's crown jewel event where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen. "This year's party is particularly important," Lenora announced over breakfast one morning, her eyes sliding past Clarissa as if she were invisible. "The guest list must be absolutely perfect. Standards must be maintained." The implication landed like a slap. You are the flaw in our perfect picture. You are the thing that must be managed. And still, Eric said nothing. That night, alone in the bedroom that had become her prison, Clarissa opened the drawer where she kept her mother's letters. Those precious pieces of paper that smelled like lavender and memory. Beneath them lay a gold necklace, simple but elegant, with an inscription on the back she'd never fully understood, "For Clarissa, when the time comes." Her mother had given it to her with strange, weighted words. "This belonged to your father, sweetheart. I know I've never spoken of him, but there are things you'll need to know someday. When the moment is right, everything will make sense." Clarissa had never pushed for details about the father she'd never known, accepting her mother's gentle evasions as simply the way things were, But lately there'd been letters arriving from law firms with names that sounded expensive and important. Official documents she'd been too overwhelmed by her daily humiliations to open. She held the necklace now, its weight somehow comforting in her palm, and felt something shift inside her. Some fundamental understanding that patience wasn't weakness and silence wasn't surrender. Her mother had taught her to endure. But she'd also taught her to watch, to wait, to recognize when the moment finally arrived. The Christmas gala was 3 days away, and Clarissa fastened the necklace around her neck, feeling its gold warm against her skin like a promise she didn't yet understand, but was finally ready to keep. The Van Halen mansion had never looked more beautiful or more dangerous than it did on Christmas Eve. Its limestone facade transformed into something between a cathedral and a fortress, every window glowing with warm light that promised elegance, while concealing the cold calculations happening within. Snow fell in thick, perfect flakes, blanketing Fifth Avenue in white silence. And inside the Grand Hall, preparations for the annual gala had reached a fever pitch of controlled chaos. Crystal chandeliers threw prismatic light across polished marble floors, their reflections dancing like diamonds scattered across black ice. Massive arrangements of white roses and winter greenery lined the entrance, their perfume so heavy it felt like breathing in money itself. The catering staff moved with military precision, their uniforms crisp and movements choreographed, arranging champagne flutes in perfect geometric patterns, adjusting silver platters with microscopic attention to detail. This wasn't just a party. It was a performance of power, a yearly ritual where Manhattan's elite gathered not to celebrate Christmas, but to reinforce the social hierarchies that governed their world, to see who'd risen and who'd fallen, who deserved their place at the table, and who'd be quietly erased from next year's guest list. Lenora Van Halen stood at the center of it all like a general surveying her troops. Her emerald gown chosen specifically to complement the decor, her jewelry selected to send precise messages about wealth that didn't need to announce itself. "The Rothschilds confirmed," she said to her assistant, checking items off a leather-bound list with the satisfaction of someone marking victories in a war only she understood. "The Astas are sending regrets, but the Vanderbilts are attending, which is far more important anyway. We've managed to secure the mayor, 3 senators, and that delightful ambassador, who always brings the most interesting gossip from Washington." She paused, her eyes scanning the room with a kind of critical assessment that could find fault in perfection. "Where is Clarissa? Please tell me she's not planning to embarrass us by appearing in something from a department store." Clarissa stood in her bedroom 3 floors above, staring at her reflection with a mixture of determination and dread. The gold necklace her mother had given her resting against her collarbone like a talisman she didn't yet understand. Her dress was modest by Van Halen standards, a deep green silk that she'd chosen carefully, elegant enough to show respect for the occasion, but simple enough not to invite accusations of trying too hard. She knew it wouldn't matter. Lenora would find fault regardless, would catalog every perceived inadequacy, and file it away as evidence of Clarissa's fundamental unsuitability for this world. The past 3 days had been a masterclass in exclusion disguised as preparation, with Lenora making all the important decisions while relegating Clarissa to tasks so trivial they were clearly meant as insults. "Perhaps you could arrange the place cards for the children's table," Lenora had suggested yesterday, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure that's more your speed." Vanessa had been a constant presence during the preparations, her opinions solicited and valued in ways Clarissa never were, her laughter filling spaces that should have belonged to Eric's wife, her comfort in the mansion's rhythms, making Clarissa feel like the interloper in her own home. "Darling, what do you think of this seating arrangement?" Lenora would ask Vanessa, ignoring Clarissa completely even as she stood right there, present but invisible, acknowledged only when there was criticism to deliver or blame to assign. Eric had barely spoken to her in days, too consumed with business obligations, and too comfortable letting his mother orchestrate everything to notice his wife's systematic erasure. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone, watching others make decisions about your life as if you didn't exist? What does that kind of exclusion do to a person's soul? The guests began arriving at 7, their entrance orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, each name announced by a butler whose voice carried the weight of judgment disguised as formality. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Blackwell III, he intoned. And the couple swept in with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having had to prove they belonged anywhere. Senator Patricia Whitmore and guest. The Honorable Judge Marcus Chun. Each announcement was a declaration of status, a confirmation that these people had earned their place in this room through blood or money or power. And as Clarissa descended the grand staircase to take her place beside Eric, she could feel the weight of 100 gauges landing on her like physical blows. The whispers started immediately, barely disguised behind champagne flutes and polite smiles. "That's Eric's wife," she heard someone murmur, the word wife carrying a question mark. "Where on earth did he find her?" another voice responded. And someone laughed in a way that made Clarissa's cheeks burn. Eric stood at the base of the stairs, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo. And for just a moment as she approached, Clarissa let herself hope that maybe tonight he'd remember the man he'd been when they met, the one who'd claimed to love her authenticity, her difference from everyone else. But when she reached him, his eyes barely registered her presence before sliding past to greet an arriving couple with far more enthusiasm than he'd shown his own wife. "Clarissa, go make yourself useful," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the kind of casual dismissal that hurt worse than anger. "Mother needs help with something in the back." Lenora was holding court in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by women whose jewelry could have funded small countries, their faces lifted and tucked into expressions of permanent surprise and approval. She spotted Clarissa approaching, and something predatory flashed in her eyes, the look of a hunter who'd just spotted easy prey. "Oh, there you are," Lenora said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough that the women around her could hear. "Ladies, this is my daughter-in-law Clarissa. Isn't her dress quaint?" The word landed like a knife between ribs, precise and devastating, and the women's smiles sharpened into something cruel. "How charming," one of them said, her eyes raking over Clarissa's dress with obvious judgment. "So refreshingly simple." Another woman tittered behind her hand. "I suppose not everyone can afford haute couture. How brave of you to work with what you have, dear." Clarissa felt heat rising in her chest, but forced her expression to remain neutral, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "They want a reaction. Don't give them one." "Thank you," she said quietly, meeting each woman's eyes in turn with a calm she didn't feel. "I believe true elegance doesn't require a designer label to validate it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass, and Lenora's smile turned glacial. "How philosophical," she said, the words dripping with condescension. "Though I've always found that people who claim not to care about appearances are usually just making excuses for not being able to afford better. Don't you agree, ladies?" The women laughed on cue, their amusement choreographed and cruel, and Clarissa felt something inside her begin to crack, not from weakness, but from the pressure of holding everything together while the world pressed down from all sides. Then Vanessa appeared, gliding through the crowd like she owned not just the room, but everyone in it. Her red dress, so perfectly chosen, it seemed designed specifically to make Clarissa's green one look dowdy by comparison. She moved directly to Lenora's side, kissing her cheek with a familiarity that broadcast ownership and belonging, before turning to acknowledge Clarissa with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Clarissa," she said, the name somehow sounding like an insult in her mouth. "Still here, I see. How tenacious of you." The women around them laughed again, emboldened by Vanessa's casual cruelty, and Lenora beamed at her like a proud mother looking at her real daughter. "Vanessa, darling, you look absolutely stunning. That Valentino is perfect for you." Vanessa preened under the compliment, then turned her attention back to Clarissa with mock concern. "You know, Clarissa, if you ever need advice on dressing for these occasions, I'd be happy to help. It must be so difficult navigating this world when you didn't grow up in it. I imagine everything feels rather overwhelming." The offer was poisoned honey, sympathy weaponized into humiliation, and Clarissa could see exactly what was happening. The way they were positioning her spatially and socially, marking her as the outsider, the charity case, the mistake that Eric would eventually correct. That's very kind, Clarissa replied, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. But I'm managing just fine. Vanessa's smile sharpened. Of course you are, dear. Though managing and thriving are rather different things, aren't they? She linked her arm through Lenora's, physically demonstrating their alliance. Come, Lenora, I promise to introduce you to that gallery owner from Paris. I'm sure Clarissa can entertain herself for a while. Perhaps she could check on the catering? I understand she has experience with that sort of thing. The dismissal was absolute, and as they walked away, Clarissa heard Vanessa's voice drift back, pitched just loud enough to ensure she'd hear. How long do you think he'll keep her around? Surely Eric will come to his senses eventually. The humiliation continued throughout the evening with surgical precision, each cut calculated to hurt without leaving visible scars. Clarissa found herself repeatedly directed toward the back of rooms, spatially marginalized in ways that announced her lesser status to everyone present. When dinner was served, she discovered she'd been seated at a table near the kitchen entrance, far from Eric, who sat at the head table beside Vanessa, their heads bent together in conversation that excluded everyone else. The guests at Clarissa's table were polite but distant, their questions about her background clearly designed to expose her humble origins. So where did you attend university? An elderly woman asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer wouldn't satisfy. I didn't, Clarissa admitted, seeing no point in lying. I worked after high school to help support my mother. The woman's expression shifted from curiosity to pity, touched with contempt. How unfortunate. Education is so important in our circles. I can't imagine trying to navigate society without that foundation. Another guest, a man whose watch probably cost more than Clarissa's entire wardrobe, leaned in with false interest. And what does your family do? Are they in business? The question was a trap, and they both knew it. My mother was a seamstress, Clarissa said, lifting her chin slightly. She taught me that honest work has dignity regardless of pay. The man exchanged glances with the woman, their judgment silent but screaming. These people didn't value honest work. They valued inherited wealth, prestigious schools, the right last names and connections that opened doors before you even knocked. Clarissa's worth in their eyes was measured by things she didn't have and could never acquire, and they wanted her to know it, to feel it, to understand exactly how far beneath them she stood. What would you do if you were invited to a celebration only to be treated like an unwelcome servant? Would you leave immediately? Or would you endure the humiliation because somewhere deep down you knew your time was coming? As the evening progressed, Clarissa noticed children being repositioned throughout the room, their presence used as another tool of social judgment. Wealthy mothers showed off their perfectly dressed offspring like accessories, while Clarissa, who had no children, became the subject of whispered speculation. I heard they've been married almost a year, she overheard one woman say. No children yet. Perhaps there are fertility issues. Or perhaps Eric is having second thoughts. The cruelty was casual, thoughtless in its assumption that Clarissa wouldn't hear or wouldn't matter if she did, and she felt herself shrinking inward, trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less vulnerable to the constant assault of judgment and dismissal. But then her hand touched the gold necklace at her throat, her mother's gift, and something inside her steadied. She'd survived poverty, her mother's death, the daily indignities of being underestimated and dismissed. She could survive this too. She would survive this. And somehow, without knowing how or when, she would make them all regret underestimating her. Eric appeared briefly at her side, drink in hand, his face flushed with alcohol and the pleasure of being surrounded by his own kind. Are you having fun? He asked. The question so absurd given everything happening around them that Clarissa almost laughed. It's quite an evening, she replied carefully, and he nodded without really hearing her, his attention already drifting back toward the main hall, where Vanessa's laugh rang out like a bell demanding his return. Good, he mumbled, then leaned closer, his breath heavy with whiskey. Try to blend in, okay? Mother worked hard on this party, and I don't want any drama. The accusation was implicit. If there was drama, it would be Clarissa's fault for existing, for failing to disappear completely, for having the audacity to be present in spaces where she clearly didn't belong. He walked away without waiting for a response, and Clarissa stood there in her modest green dress, surrounded by hostile elegance and casual cruelty, feeling the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down like snow accumulating on a roof that might collapse at any moment. The first hour of the gala had been brutal, but what came next transformed casual cruelty into orchestrated destruction, each moment carefully designed to break Clarissa's composure in front of Manhattan's most influential witnesses. Lenora had gathered a cluster of society women near the grand fireplace, their jewels catching the light like weapons being polished before battle. And when she spotted Clarissa attempting to navigate toward a quieter corner, her eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction. "Clarissa, darling, come here," Lenora called out, her voice carrying across the room with false sweetness that made several conversations pause. "We were just discussing the importance of proper breeding in maintaining social standards. I'm sure you'd have such an interesting perspective on the topic." The trap was obvious but unavoidable, and as Clarissa approached, she could feel the weight of attention shifting toward her like searchlights converging on an escaped prisoner. The women formed a semicircle around her, their expensive perfumes mixing into something suffocating, their smiles sharp enough to draw blood. "Your dress is so charming," one of them said, the word charming weaponized into an insult. "Where did you find it? I don't recognize the designer." Clarissa kept her voice steady, refusing to show the panic rising in her chest. "It's a small boutique. Nothing you'd know." Another woman laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "How delightfully humble. Though I suppose when one comes from limited means, one learns to make do with whatever's available. It must be quite an adjustment, going from shopping at discount stores to attending events like this." Lenora placed a hand on Clarissa's shoulder, the touch seeming maternal, but the grip tight enough to hurt. "Now, ladies, let's not be unkind. Clarissa is doing her very best to fit in, and we should applaud her effort, even if the execution leaves something to be desired. After all, breeding isn't something one can simply acquire through marriage, is it?" The women murmured agreement, their judgment coordinated and absolute, and Clarissa felt something twist in her stomach, not quite nausea, but close, the physical manifestation of humiliation, so complete it made her body want to reject the experience entirely. Vanessa materialized at the edge of the group, like a predator drawn to the scent of wounded prey, her red dress a declaration of confidence and belonging that made Clarissa's green one seem even more inadequate by comparison. "Oh my," Vanessa said, her eyes scanning Clarissa with theatrical concern. "Are we discussing fashion? How brave of you, Clarissa, to enter such dangerous territory." She stepped closer, invading Clarissa's personal space with the ease of someone who'd never been told no. "You know, there's actually a wonderful charity that provides professional wardrobes for women trying to enter higher social circles. They do marvelous work helping people who need guidance. I could get you their information if you'd like." The offer landed like a slap disguised as generosity, and the women around them barely contained their amusement, some hiding smiles behind champagne flutes, while others laughed openly at the humiliation playing out before them. Clarissa's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks, but her face remained composed, her mother's training holding even as everything inside her screamed to fight back, to defend herself, to make them understand that she was worth more than their cruel judgments. But she stayed silent because she understood something they didn't. Every insult they delivered, every moment of orchestrated humiliation, was being cataloged and stored, evidence in a case she didn't yet know how to prosecute, but trusted would eventually matter. Have you ever had to stand still while people tore you apart with words, knowing that defending yourself would only make things worse? How do you keep breathing when the air itself feels poisoned with contempt? The humiliation escalated when Lenora directed everyone toward the main hall for the evening's entertainment, and Clarissa found herself physically repositioned to the very back of the room, separated from Eric by what felt like miles of hostile territory. The spatial marginalization was deliberate and devastating, a public announcement that she didn't belong with the inner circle, that her place was at the margins where unimportant people stood and watched real society conduct its business. Children were being shown off near the front, their expensive clothes and polished manners displayed like trophies, while their mothers accepted compliments with practiced modesty that barely concealed their pride. "Your daughter is absolutely exquisite," Clarissa heard someone tell a woman standing near Eric. "She'll make such an advantageous match someday." The woman beamed, then her eyes found Clarissa standing alone in the back, and her expression shifted to something between pity and disdain. "Some people understand the importance of legacy," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for Clarissa to hear. "And some people marry for convenience and hope no one notices they don't belong." Vanessa, who had positioned herself directly beside Eric at the front of the room, leaned close to whisper something in his ear, and he actually laughed, his head thrown back in genuine amusement, while his wife stood isolated and humiliated 20 feet away. The message was unmistakable. "This is where you belong," Vanessa seemed to be saying with every gesture, every laugh, every casual touch of Eric's arm. "And this is where she belongs, alone and forgotten, a mistake we're all too polite to acknowledge directly." The entertainment began with a string quartet performing classical pieces that Clarissa recognized from her mother's old radio. Music that had once brought comfort now twisted into a soundtrack for her public degradation. Lenora stood to make a speech, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime commanding rooms like this. "Thank you all for joining us on this special evening," she began, her smile encompassing everyone except Clarissa. "The Van Halen family has always believed in maintaining traditions, in preserving the standards that make our society strong. We gather each year to celebrate not just Christmas, but the bonds of family, heritage, and shared values that connect us all." She paused for effect, her gaze sweeping the room before landing deliberately on Clarissa with an expression that turned the speech into an indictment. "Of course, every family faces challenges. Sometimes we must welcome those who don't share our background, who come from different circumstances. It tests our generosity, our patience, and our commitment to maintaining standards, even when it would be easier to simply lower them." The audience shifted uncomfortably, several people glancing toward Clarissa with obvious understanding of who Lenora was really addressing. "But we persevere," Lenora continued, her voice strengthening with conviction. "We hold fast to what matters, and we trust that time will reveal who truly belongs and who was simply passing through." The applause that followed was polite but pointed, and Clarissa felt tears burning behind her eyes, threatening to spill over and complete her humiliation in front of everyone who mattered in Eric's world. Eric caught her eye across the room for just a moment, and in that brief connection Clarissa saw something that hurt worse than any of Lenora's barbs or Vanessa's calculated cruelty. She saw awareness. He knew what was happening. He understood that his mother and his childhood friend were systematically destroying his wife in front of their entire social circle. And he was choosing to do nothing. His eyes slid away from hers almost immediately, finding Vanessa instead, and the betrayal of that choice landed like a physical blow. This wasn't ignorance or obliviousness. This was a decision. Eric was actively allowing her humiliation because stopping it would require standing up to his mother, defending a wife his family didn't approve of, choosing Clarissa over the comfortable dynamics that had governed his life long before she entered it. And he wasn't willing to do that. The realization crystallized in Clarissa's mind with brutal clarity. She was alone in this marriage, had been alone from the beginning, married to a man who loved his mother's approval more than he could ever love a woman his family deemed unsuitable. The children near the front were being called forward to receive small gifts from Lenora, each one presented with ceremony and affection that highlighted everything Clarissa would never have, the family acceptance that would always be withheld no matter how hard she tried or how perfectly she performed. "Family is everything," Lenora said, handing a beautifully wrapped box to a young girl who beamed with delight. "These are the connections that matter, the bonds that last, not the temporary intrusions that try to insert themselves where they don't belong." What would you do if the person who promised to love and protect you stood by and watched you be destroyed? Would you collapse under the weight of that betrayal? Or would you find strength in places you didn't know existed? The evening wore on with relentless cruelty, each hour bringing new variations on the same theme. Clarissa was excluded from photographs, forgotten in toasts, dismissed in conversations. Her presence acknowledged only when there were menial tasks to assign or criticisms to deliver. A guest spilled wine near her, and Vanessa appeared instantly with a napkin and theatrical concern. "Oh, dear, Clarissa, could you handle this? I'm sure you're much better equipped for cleaning than the rest of us. After all, your mother was in service, wasn't she?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and several nearby guests actually gasped at the boldness of the insult. But Lenora just smiled, nodding approvingly at Vanessa's audacity, while Eric remained conspicuously absent, having conveniently disappeared into his study with some business associates. His absence a form of permission for whatever cruelty his mother and mistress wanted to inflict. Clarissa bent to clean the spill, her hands trembling slightly as she dabbed at the expensive carpet, and she could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her like atmosphere at the bottom of the ocean. She was drowning in this world, suffocating under the pressure of their contempt, and no one was throwing her a lifeline. But as she worked, her fingers touched the gold necklace at her throat, that mysterious inheritance from her mother, and something inside her held firm. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Not ever. They could humiliate her, dismiss her, treat her like garbage in designer clothing, but they couldn't touch whatever core of strength her mother had planted in her years ago, that seed of dignity that grew in darkness and fed on adversity. By the time dessert was served, Clarissa had been reduced to something between a servant and a ghost, present but invisible, acknowledged only when her absence might cause questions, but never granted the dignity of full participation. She stood near a window watching snow fall outside, thick and peaceful, covering the city in white silence that felt like mercy after the noise and cruelty of the gala. Behind her, the party continued in full swing, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of social performance, laughter echoing off marble and crystal, the sound of people celebrating their belonging while she stood alone, excluded from the warmth. Vanessa found her there, approaching with a glass of champagne and an expression of mock sympathy that barely concealed her satisfaction. "You should probably go upstairs," Vanessa said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "This party isn't really for you, is it? You must be exhausted trying to keep up appearances." She took a sip of champagne, her eyes never leaving Clarissa's face. "Eric and I were talking earlier about how difficult this must be for you. Coming from nothing into all of this. It's really quite overwhelming, I'm sure. Maybe it would be kinder to everyone, yourself included, if you simply admitted this isn't working." The suggestion landed with the weight of a threat, a preview of conversations happening behind Clarissa's back, plans being made for her removal, her erasure, her replacement with someone who fit better into the Van Halen world. "I'm not going anywhere," Clarissa said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Vanessa smiled, the expression predatory and patient. "We'll see," she replied, turning away with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "We'll see." Eric finally reappeared near midnight, drunk and disheveled, his tie loosened and his eyes unfocused in ways that spoke of whiskey consumed to avoid reality. He found Clarissa still standing by the window, having nowhere else to go and no one to talk to, a stranger at her own husband's family party. "Hey," he said, his voice slurred slightly. "You okay?" The question was so absurd, so disconnected from everything that had happened that evening, that Clarissa almost laughed. Almost. "I'm fine," she lied, because what else could she say? That she'd spent the entire evening being systematically destroyed while he did nothing? That his mother and his mistress had made it clear she was temporary, unwanted, a problem they were working to solve? "Good," Eric mumbled, swaying slightly. "Mother says you've been quiet tonight. That's good. Don't want any scenes." He patted her shoulder awkwardly, the touch devoid of affection or real awareness, then wandered back toward the party without waiting for a response, leaving Clarissa alone with the snow and the silence, and the growing certainty that something fundamental had broken inside her marriage, perhaps had been broken from the start. The party continued around her, hostile and glittering, and she stood at its edge, cataloging every insult, every betrayal, every moment of calculated cruelty, storing them somewhere deep where they could transform from wounds into weapons. She didn't know how yet, didn't understand what power she might eventually wield, but her mother's voice echoed in her memory with increasing clarity. Real power waits. It watches. And when the moment comes, it doesn't ask for permission. Clarissa touched the gold necklace again, feeling its weight like a promise, and waited for whatever came next. The evening had settled into a rhythm of controlled chaos, guests circulating through the mansion's grand rooms with champagne-fueled confidence, their conversations growing louder and less guarded as midnight approached. Clarissa remained at her post near the window, a silent observer cataloging every interaction, every alliance, every subtle power play unfolding in the gilded space around her. She'd learned long ago that invisibility could be a gift if you knew how to use it, that people revealed their truest selves when they forgot you were watching. Lenora held court in the main hall, surrounded by admirers who laughed at her observations and competed for her attention with the desperation of courtiers seeking royal favor. Vanessa circulated with practiced ease, touching arms and whispering confidences, building alliances and reinforcing her position as the woman who truly belonged in Eric's life. And Eric himself moved through it all with the oblivious confidence of someone who'd never had to question his place in the world. His birthright so secure he couldn't imagine it being challenged. But something was shifting in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the evening's earlier humiliations and everything to do with a small envelope that had just been delivered to Eric's hand by one of the household staff. Clarissa noticed it immediately, her attention sharpening on that unremarkable piece of paper like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, sealed with dark blue wax that caught the light as Eric turned it over in his hands. His expression changed as he examined it, confusion flickering across his features before settling into something harder to read, a tightening around his eyes that suggested unexpected information, unwelcome surprises. He broke the seal with his thumb and extracted a single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the contents with increasing intensity, and Clarissa watched his posture shift almost imperceptibly, his shoulders pulling back, his jaw clenching in a way she'd learned to recognize as stress he was trying to hide. Eric's gaze lifted from the paper and swept the room with new assessment, landing on faces he'd known his entire life, as if seeing them differently now, recalculating social equations that had seemed fixed and permanent just moments before. Then his eyes found Clarissa standing alone by the window, and for the first time that evening really found her not glancing past, but actually seeing her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. Or rather, something had changed in ways she didn't yet understand, but could feel like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. Eric folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and controlled, then made his way across the room toward where Lenora stood laughing with her inner circle. Clarissa couldn't hear their conversation from where she stood, but she could read the body language. The way Eric leaned close to his mother's ear and murmured something that made her expression freeze. The way Lenora's hand reached out to steady herself against a nearby table. The way her eyes went sharp and calculating as she processed whatever information he'd just delivered. Vanessa noticed the exchange and inserted herself into it immediately, her expression shifting from confident to concerned as Eric showed both women the paper from the envelope. Whatever was written on that page was causing ripples in the established order, creating uncertainty where there had been absolute confidence just minutes before. What information could possibly shake people who seemed so secure in their power? What truth could make the architects of humiliation suddenly look vulnerable? The conversation between Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa grew more intense, their voices rising just enough that fragments reached Clarissa across the crowded room. "Are you certain?" she heard Lenora demand, her usual composure cracking slightly. "There must be some mistake." Eric's response was too quiet to hear, but his gesture toward the paper in his hand was emphatic, insistent. Vanessa placed a hand on his arm, leaning close with an intimacy that would have stung earlier, but now seemed desperate rather than possessive, as if she were trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away. "It doesn't change anything," Vanessa said. her voice carrying just far enough for Clarissa to catch the edge of panic in it. "Does it?" But Eric's expression suggested it might change everything, and he pulled away from both women, running a hand through his hair in frustration before turning to scan the room again, his eyes seeking and finding Clarissa with an expression that mingled confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. The audience watching this unfold would feel the tension building, understanding that whatever was written on that paper concerned Clarissa directly, that the woman they'd watched being systematically destroyed all evening somehow held power these people hadn't known about, hadn't prepared for, couldn't control. The suspense was exquisite, the kind of slow-building anticipation that kept viewers riveted, because they knew the payoff was coming, but couldn't yet see its shape. Clarissa maintained her position by the window, refusing to show curiosity or concern even as her mind raced through possibilities. The envelope had arrived with purpose and timing that felt orchestrated, delivered at this specific moment in the evening when humiliations had reached their peak and her isolation was absolute. She thought about the unopened letters from law firms that had been arriving at her small apartment before she'd moved into the mansion, official correspondence she'd ignored because surviving her daily life had consumed all her energy. She thought about her mother's mysterious words about her father, the gold necklace she wore even now, the strange inheritance she'd never fully investigated because grief and then marriage had pushed it to the background of her consciousness. Could those letters have contained information that connected to whatever was written on that paper Eric held? Could her mother's careful evasions about her father's identity have been protecting secrets that were now surfacing at the worst and best possible moment? The questions tumbled through her mind, but her face remained calm, almost serene, the mask of composure she'd learned to wear so well that it had become a second skin. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her react, would not confirm or deny whatever they were learning about her, would simply wait with the patience her mother had taught her and let the truth reveal itself in its own time. The party continued around them, but the energy had shifted, conversations growing quieter as guests noticed the tension between Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa, the way they huddled together like generals whose battle plans had just been compromised. Some of the society matrons who'd participated in Clarissa's humiliation were now glancing between her and the troubled trio with new calculation in their eyes, the predatory instinct that made them experts at reading power shifts before they became obvious to everyone else. "Something's happening," Clarissa heard one woman whisper to another. "Did you see Eric's face when he read that paper? And the way Lenora went pale." Her companion leaned closer, voice dropping to conspiratorial levels. "I heard it was the final guest list for this evening. Apparently, there are names on it that no one was expecting." The first woman's eyes widened. "Names that matter? Names that change everything," came the cryptic response, and both women turned to study Clarissa with expressions that had shifted from contempt to uncertainty, as if they were reconsidering earlier judgments and wondering if they'd backed the wrong horse in a race that wasn't over yet. Have you ever watched people who dismissed you suddenly realize they might have made a terrible mistake? That moment when their certainty cracks, and you can see them scrambling to reassess everything they thought they knew? Eric finally broke away from his mother and Vanessa, moving through the crowd with new urgency, his destination clearly Clarissa herself. Guests parted to let him through, their attention following him with undisguised curiosity, sensing drama unfolding and positioning themselves to witness whatever came next. When he reached her, his expression was complicated. Layers of emotion fighting for dominance behind eyes that had ignored her all evening and now couldn't look away. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Now." Clarissa met his gaze with calm she didn't entirely feel, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the gold necklace at her throat. "About what?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, refusing to make this easier for him. Eric glanced around at the audience they'd accumulated, faces watching them with predatory interest, then lowered his voice. "Not here. Upstairs. There are things I need to ask you, things I should have asked a long time ago." He reached for her arm, but stopped himself. The gesture aborted mid-movement, as if he suddenly wasn't sure he had the right to touch her anymore. Please, he added, and the word sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd never learned to speak properly. Clarissa considered refusing, forcing him to have this conversation in front of everyone who'd witnessed her humiliation. But some instinct told her the revelation would be more powerful if it unfolded with proper timing, if the anticipation built until the truth landed with maximum impact. Lead the way, she said quietly, and followed him toward the stairs, aware of every eye tracking their movement, every whispered speculation about what was happening, the way Lenora and Vanessa watched them go with expressions that mingled fury and fear. Eric's study was on the second floor, a masculine space of leather and dark with that smell of cigars and expensive whiskey, the kind of room where powerful men made deals and decided fates. He closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment as if needing its support, then pulled the paper from his pocket and held it out toward Clarissa, without meeting her eyes. "This is tonight's final guest list," he said, his voice strained. "It arrived late. Some last-minute confirmations that my mother's assistant wasn't aware of." He paused, seeming to struggle with how to continue. "There are names on here that don't make sense. Important names. People who shouldn't have any connection to our family, who wouldn't normally attend one of Mother's parties." Clarissa took the paper from his hand, their fingers brushing briefly, and looked down at the typewritten list of names in elegant script. Most were familiar from earlier in the evening. The society figures and political connections she'd expected. But near the bottom, several names stood out, struck through with handwritten notes that made her breath catch in her throat. Theodore Stanton Foundation representatives, Stanton Industries board members, personal attorneys from Stanton's estate. The name that had been hidden from her entire life, the father she'd never known, suddenly appearing in the context of Eric's family party like a ghost demanding recognition. "Who is Theodore Stanton to you?" Eric asked, finally meeting her eyes with an intensity that suggested he already suspected the answer, but needed her to confirm it. The assistant who delivered this said these people confirmed their attendance, specifically because you would be here. They said they were here to see Theodore Stanton's daughter. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither fully understood yet. Clarissa's mind raced. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving suddenly clicking into place with devastating clarity. "My father," she said quietly, the admission feeling both monumental and strangely anticlimactic after all the years of not knowing, not asking, accepting her mother's silence as protection rather than mystery. "Theodore Stanton was my father. My mother never told me much about him, just that he died before I was born, and that someday I'd understand why she kept his identity private." She looked down at the guest list again, seeing not just names but power, connections, the kind of influence that shaped worlds and moved mountains. "I've been receiving letters from his attorneys, but I never opened them. I was too busy surviving to deal with the past." Eric's face had gone pale, the reality of what this meant hitting him with visible force. Theodore Stanton wasn't just any wealthy man. He was a legend, a trillionaire whose empire touched everything from technology to real estate to political influence at the highest levels. His death 6 months ago had made international headlines, the question of his heir and his fortune's distribution creating speculation and legal battles that were still ongoing. And Clarissa, the woman his mother had spent the evening humiliating, the wife he'd allowed to be dismissed and degraded in front of everyone who mattered, was that heir. "Oh God," Eric whispered, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "What have we done? What would you do if you discovered the person you treated as worthless actually held more power than everyone who judged them combined?" Clarissa carefully refolded the paper and held it out to Eric, but he didn't take it, staring at her instead as if seeing her for the first time, recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married, and then systematically failed to protect. "Those people downstairs," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "the ones from my father's foundation and companies. When do they arrive?" Eric checked his watch with shaking hands. "They're probably already here. The list said they were confirmed for 11:30, and it's nearly midnight." He ran both hands through his hair, panic evident in every movement. Clarissa, I need you to understand. If any of us had known, but you didn't know, she interrupted gently. The kindness in her voice, somehow more devastating than anger would have been. And that's precisely the point, isn't it? You judged me, dismissed me, allowed me to be humiliated based on assumptions about who I was and what I was worth. The fact that my father was wealthy doesn't change anything about who I actually am. It just changes how you see me. The truth landed between them like a verdict, and Eric had no defense to offer because she was absolutely right. They'd treated her as disposable not because of anything she'd done but because of where she'd come from. And now that they knew she came from somewhere that mattered, somewhere that had power and influence they couldn't ignore, they were scrambling to recalculate, to manage the situation, to salvage what they'd carelessly destroyed. A knock on the study door interrupted the charged silence, and Lenora entered without waiting for permission. Vanessa closed behind her, both women's faces tight with barely controlled emotion. Is it true? Lenora demanded, her composure cracked enough to show the calculation underneath. Are you really Theodore Stanton's daughter? Clarissa turned to face them, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to stand at full height, to meet their gazes without the protective softness she usually employed, to let them see the strength she'd been carefully concealing behind humility and patience. Yes, she said simply, the single word carrying more weight than any of Lenora's elaborate speeches. My mother was Theodore Stanton's great love, the woman he never got to marry because he died before I was born. She raised me alone, never using his name or claiming his fortune, because she wanted me to build my own life without the complications of his wealth. She died last year, and his attorneys have been trying to reach me about the inheritance, but I was too wrapped up in trying to make this marriage work to deal with it. She paused, letting that sink in, watching the color drain from Vanessa's face and fury flash in Lenora's eyes. The guest list includes representatives who've been trying to locate me for months to finalize the estate. They tracked me here, to your party, to witness what's been happening to Theodore Stanton's only child. The implications were catastrophic, social suicide for anyone who'd participated in humiliating the daughter of one of the world's most powerful men. And the three people standing before Clarissa understood that with crystalline clarity. The balance of power had shifted so dramatically that the room itself seemed to tilt, and for the first time in her marriage, Clarissa stood at the center, while everyone else scrambled at the edges, trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that had already spiraled beyond their control. The silence in Eric's study stretched like wire pulled to breaking point. For people suspended in the moment before everything they knew about their world shattered and reformed into something unrecognizable. Lenora's face had gone from pale to flushed, rage and calculation warring behind eyes that had spent decades reading social situations and positioning herself advantageously, but now found themselves facing a scenario she'd never anticipated and had no script prepared for. Vanessa stood frozen near the door, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog under harsh sunlight, her hand still resting on the doorknob, as if some part of her wanted to flee before the full weight of this revelation crushed her completely. Eric looked between his mother, his mistress, and his wife with the dawning horror of a man realizing he'd been standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, one step away from a fall that would destroy everything. Theodore Stanton, Lenora finally said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure when everything inside her was screaming. You're telling us that you, a girl from nowhere with no family and no connections, are the daughter of Theodore Stanton? The disbelief in her tone was layered with desperate hope that this was somehow a mistake, a confusion that could be corrected. Because accepting it as truth meant accepting that she'd spent the entire evening orchestrating the public humiliation of one of the most powerful heiresses in the world. Clarissa met her mother-in-law's gaze with steady calm, the kind that came from finally understanding the full picture, from pieces of her life clicking into place after years of confusion. My mother loved him, she said quietly, each word deliberate and weighted with truth that couldn't be argued away. She was working as a seamstress when they met, making costumes for a theater production he was funding. She said he saw her differently than anyone else ever had, that he valued her mind and her heart rather than what she could do for his image or his empire. They were planning to marry when he died in a plane crash. She was already pregnant with me, The story unfolded like testimony in a courtroom. Facts presented without embellishment, but devastating in their simplicity. She never told me who he was because she didn't want me growing up as a target, didn't want his wealth to define me or his enemies to use me. She wanted me to build my own character first, to understand the value of work and integrity before I inherited power I hadn't earned. Vanessa found her voice first, desperation making her bold in ways common sense should have prevented. "That's impossible," she said, stepping forward with hands clenched at her sides. "Theodore Stanton never married, never acknowledged any children. This is clearly some kind of con. Some scheme you've been planning all along to worm your way into." "Enough," Eric cut her off, his voice sharp with new authority born from understanding the catastrophic mistake they'd all made. "Vanessa, stop." He turned to Clarissa, and for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in their marriage, he looked at her with something approaching respect mixed with bone-deep fear. "The attorneys on the guest list, can they verify this?" Clarissa nodded slowly, pulling a chain from beneath her dress to reveal the gold necklace she'd worn all evening, the one her tormentors had probably noticed and dismissed as costume jewelry from a discount store. "My mother gave me this before she died. It has an inscription." She unclasped it and held it out, the gold catching light from the desk lamp as Eric took it with trembling hands. He read the engraving aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "For Clarissa, daughter of my heart, Theodore Stanton." The words hung in the air like a judge's verdict, irrevocable and absolute. And even Lenora couldn't dismiss physical evidence that matched documented records of Stanton's personal effects. "There are DNA results in the letters I haven't opened," Clarissa continued, taking the necklace back and refastening it around her neck. "His attorneys conducted tests using samples my mother provided before she died, knowing this day would eventually come. They've been trying to reach me for 6 months to formalize the inheritance, to introduce me to the boards and foundations, to transfer assets worth more than most countries' GDP. She paused, letting the magnitude of that sink in. "And tonight, they came here expecting to find me welcomed as the Van Halen family's treasure, Eric's beloved wife, who would bring unprecedented wealth and influence to your social circle." Her eyes moved between Lenora and Vanessa with devastating clarity. "Instead, they'll arrive to find that you've spent the evening treating Theodore Stanton's only child like garbage." The implications crashed over them like a wave, and Lenora actually swayed, reaching out to steady herself against Eric's desk as the full scope of the disaster became clear. Manhattan society operated on carefully maintained relationships, networks of influence and favor that took generations to build and could be destroyed in a single evening if you made the wrong enemy. Humiliating the daughter of Theodore Stanton wasn't just a social misstep, it was career-ending, reputation-destroying. The kind of mistake that would see the Van Halen name removed from invitation lists and board positions, their influence evaporating overnight as people scrambled to distance themselves from the family stupid enough to make such a catastrophic error in judgment. "You have to understand," Lenora began, her voice taking on a pleading quality that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. "If we had known, if anyone had told us about your connection, but that's exactly it," Clarissa interrupted, her patience with excuses exhausted. "You didn't need to know about my father to treat me with basic human dignity. You chose to humiliate me based on assumptions about my worth, judgments made purely on the fact that I came from modest circumstances. The revelation of my father's identity doesn't change who I am. It only changes how you see me, which tells me everything I need to know about all of you." The moral clarity of her position was unassailable, and even Lenora, skilled in the art of social maneuvering and reputation management, had no counter-argument that wouldn't make things worse. Vanessa tried once more, her voice breaking with panic that was almost pitiable. "Clarissa, surely you understand we never meant any real harm. It was just society politics, the way things are done in our world. Everyone tests newcomers. It's how we maintain standards. You can't hold a few comments against us when we were simply following tradition." The attempt to minimize the evening's cruelty was so transparent, so desperate, that it actually drew a bitter laugh from Eric. "A few comments," he said, rounding on Vanessa with anger finally finding its proper target. You spent the entire evening systematically destroying my wife's dignity in front of everyone who matters in Manhattan. You called her a peasant, suggested she needed charity to dress properly, treated her like a servant in her own home. And mother, he turned to Lenora with accusation burning in his eyes. You orchestrated all of it, positioned her at the back of rooms, excluded her from conversations, made it clear she was temporary and unwelcome. The truth spilling from his mouth seemed to surprise him as much as them, as if he was only now allowing himself to see what he'd been complicit in through his silence. And I did nothing, he added quietly, the admission costing him something visible. I stood by and watched it happen because defending her would have meant standing up to you, mother, and I wasn't willing to do that. A knock on the study door interrupted the confessions and accusations, and a household staff member entered with careful professionalism, her eyes deliberately not registering the tension in the room. Mr. Van Halen, there are guests downstairs requesting to speak with Mrs. Clarissa Van Halen. They say they're from the Stanton Foundation and have been trying to reach her for some time. The woman's voice was neutral, but her posture suggested she understood the significance of what was happening. That word was already spreading through the household staff about the bombshell that had just detonated in Manhattan society. Eric looked at Clarissa, his face a mixture of plea and resignation. What do you want to do? He asked, and the question carried weight beyond its simple words. He was asking if she would publicly destroy them, if she would allow the Stanton representatives to witness the aftermath of her humiliation and carry that story into every boardroom and society dinner in New York, or if she would show mercy they absolutely didn't deserve. Clarissa stood perfectly still for a moment, feeling the weight of decision, the power she'd never known she possessed, now fully hers to wield however she chose. Every insult from that evening played through her memory like cards being laid on a table. Every dismissal, every calculated cruelty, every moment Eric had chosen silence over defense. The question wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about who she wanted to be when she finally claimed her rightful place in the world. Would she become like them, using power to crush and humiliate, or would she forge a different path, one that honored her mother's teachings about dignity and strength? Have you ever held someone's entire future in your hands and had to decide whether to destroy them or show them mercy they never showed you? What would it take for you to choose kindness after enduring such deliberate cruelty? Send them up, Clarissa said finally, her voice steady and clear, and ask them to bring the documents they've been trying to deliver. It's time I understood exactly what my father left me. The staff member nodded and disappeared, and in the silence that followed, Clarissa watched three people who'd spent the evening treating her like nothing realize they were about to face the consequences of their choices in the most public and permanent way possible. Lenora's composure had finally cracked completely, her face showing raw fear beneath the carefully maintained facade. Clarissa, please, she said, the words sounding foreign and wrong coming from a woman who never begged. Whatever you're planning, whatever you're thinking of doing, remember that Eric is your husband. Destroying his family destroys your marriage. The threat was subtle but clear, an attempt to bind Clarissa's choices to her commitment, to use love as leverage against justice. But Clarissa just smiled sadly, the expression more devastating than anger would have been. My marriage was destroyed the moment Eric chose your approval over my dignity, she replied gently. Everything that happens now is just making that truth visible. Vanessa backed toward the door, self-preservation finally overriding her desire to maintain position, but Eric moved to block her exit. No, he said firmly. You wanted to be part of this family, to have a place at our table? Then you stay and face what we've done together. No more running, no more hiding behind social games and plausible deniability. For once, Vanessa had no response, no clever comment or calculated touch to redirect the moment, and she sank into a chair near the window, looking smaller than Clarissa had ever seen her. Footsteps approached in the hallway, measured and professional, and then the door opened to admit three people who carried themselves with the quiet authority of those who managed empires and shaped policy. The lead attorney was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that took in the scene instantly, reading the tension and fear with practiced assessment. Behind her stood two men, one young and clearly nervous, the other older with a kind of face that suggested he'd seen everything and was rarely surprised by human nature anymore. "Mrs. Van Halen," the woman said, moving directly to Clarissa and extending her hand with warmth that suggested genuine feeling rather than professional courtesy. "I'm Margaret Chun, senior partner at Chun & Associates and personal attorney to the late Theodore Stanton. We've been trying to reach you for months, and when we learned you'd be here this evening, we thought it was finally time to meet face to face." She glanced at Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what had been happening before they arrived. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." The slight emphasis on important carried layers of meaning, and Clarissa felt something shift in her chest, the final piece of her transformation clicking into place. These people had come for her, not to judge or dismiss, but to honor her father's wishes and bring her into a legacy she'd never known she possessed. "You're not interrupting," Clarissa said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "In fact, your timing is perfect. I think it's time I learned exactly who my father was and what he wanted for me." Margaret smiled with satisfaction, pulling a leather portfolio from her briefcase and setting it on Eric's desk with the weight of destiny being delivered. "Your father was one of the most brilliant and generous men I've ever known," she said, opening the portfolio to reveal documents and photographs Clarissa had never seen. "And he left you everything, with specific instructions about how it should be managed until you were ready to claim it. He knew your mother would raise you right, would teach you to value character over wealth, and he trusted that when the time came, you'd use his fortune to do good in the world rather than just accumulate more power." She paused, her eyes moving to meet Clarissa's with intensity that demanded attention. He also left very specific instructions about how his daughter should be treated by anyone seeking access to his legacy or connections to his empire. He was very clear that your dignity and autonomy must always be respected, and that anyone who failed in that regard should be cut off completely, regardless of who they were or what positions they held. The message was unmistakable, and Lenora actually gasped, understanding that Theodore Stanton had reached from beyond the grave to protect the daughter he'd never met, giving her weapons to defend herself against exactly the kind of treatment she'd endured that evening. Margaret pulled out several documents, laying them before Clarissa with ceremonial precision. "This is the trust documentation, showing assets totaling approximately $4.2 trillion across various holdings, foundations, and investment vehicles. This is your father's personal letter to you, sealed until this moment. And these are the board positions, foundation seats, and corporate authorities that become yours upon verification of your identity and willingness to accept the inheritance." She produced the DNA results Clarissa had mentioned, official and irrefutable, proof that would satisfy any legal challenge. "Your father's will specifies that you have complete autonomy over how to use these resources. You owe nothing to anyone except your own conscience and his faith that you'd do the right thing." Clarissa's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her father's letter. The envelope yellowed with age, but the seal intact, and as she broke it open, she felt her mother's presence like a hand on her shoulder, guiding and supporting. The letter was handwritten, her father's script elegant and clear, and she read it aloud because something told her these words needed to be witnessed. "My dearest Clarissa, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you are old enough to understand the choices your mother and I made. I loved her more than life itself, and knowing she carried you, my daughter, was the greatest joy I'd ever known. I didn't want my wealth or my enemies to shape your childhood, so I trusted your mother to raise you away from all of this, to teach you what matters before money and power complicated everything. If the people around you have treated you well, valued you for who you are rather than what you can do for them, then trust them and build relationships based on that foundation. But if they have judged you, dismissed you, treated you as less than because you came from humble circumstances, remember this. They have shown you their true nature when they thought you had no power to challenge them. That is a gift of truth, painful but precious. Use it wisely." The words settled over the room like snow, beautiful and damning, and when Clarissa looked up from the letter, she saw three people who finally understood that they'd lost not just her respect, but any chance at the influence and wealth they'd assumed would eventually flow to them through Eric's marriage. The game was over, and they hadn't just lost. They'd never really been players at all. The study had become a pressure chamber, where four people who thought they understood power were learning that true authority didn't announce itself with designer clothes and social position, but waited in silence until the moment of perfect revelation. Clarissa carefully folded her father's letter and placed it back in the envelope, her movements deliberate and controlled, while inside her chest something enormous was unfurling, spreading wings she hadn't known she possessed. Margaretchen and her colleagues stood near the desk like witnesses to a coronation, their presence transforming the room from Eric's private domain into neutral ground, where old hierarchies dissolved and new ones emerged. Lenora had retreated to a chair near the fireplace, her earlier confidence completely shattered, replaced by the kind of desperate calculation that came from trying to salvage a situation that had already moved beyond salvage. She kept glancing between Clarissa and the attorneys as if searching for an angle, some way to spin this disaster into something manageable. But her face showed the growing realization that there were no clever words or social maneuvers that could undo what had been done. Vanessa remained by the window, her earlier boldness evaporated, leaving behind a woman who'd gambled everything on becoming Eric's next wife and now understood she'd bet on the wrong horse in a race she'd already lost. And Eric stood frozen in the center of it all, watching his wife transform before his eyes into someone he'd never really known, someone infinitely more powerful than the quiet woman he'd married and then systematically failed to protect. "What happens now?" Eric finally asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. "Do you make the announcement downstairs, let everyone know who you really are, while we're all here to witness our own stupidity?" The question carried resignation, as if he'd already accepted that public humiliation was the price for his choices, and was simply waiting for the bill to be delivered. Clarissa met his eyes with an expression that was neither angry nor forgiving, something more complex that defied easy categorization. "That depends," she said quietly, her hand moving to touch the gold necklace at her throat, the physical anchor that connected her to a father she'd never met, but whose legacy now rested entirely in her hands. "What do you think should happen, Eric? If you were me, standing here with proof that every assumption your family made about my worth was catastrophically wrong, what would you do?" The question hung in the air like a test, and Eric struggled visibly without an answer, his face showing the war between self-preservation and something that might have been genuine remorse. "I don't know," he admitted finally, running both hands through his hair in a gesture of exhausted defeat. "Part of me wants to beg you not to destroy us, to show mercy we absolutely don't deserve. But another part thinks maybe we need to be destroyed, that maybe that's the only way we'll understand what we've done." He looked at his mother and then at Vanessa, both women who'd shaped his life and his choices in ways he was only now beginning to question. "I've watched you endure months of cruelty, Clarissa. I've stood by while my mother treated you like an embarrassment and Vanessa acted as if your marriage didn't exist. I told myself it was just how society worked, that you needed to prove yourself, that eventually they'd accept you if you were patient enough." His voice cracked slightly, genuine emotion breaking through years of careful social conditioning. "But the truth is I was a coward. I chose their approval over your dignity because standing up to them would have been uncomfortable, and I've never had to be uncomfortable a day in my life." The admission was raw and honest in ways Eric had never been before, and Clarissa found herself feeling something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps understanding, recognition that he too had been shaped by forces he'd never questioned until this moment forced him to see them clearly. Margaretchen cleared her throat gently, drawing attention back to the practical matters at hand. "Mrs. Van Halen, there are people downstairs waiting to meet you. Representatives from your father's various enterprises, board members who've been eager to welcome Theodore Stanton's daughter into leadership positions that have stood empty since his death. They don't know what's happened here tonight, though I suspect they'll figure out quickly once they see the atmosphere." She paused, her sharp eyes assessing Clarissa with approval. "How you choose to handle this situation will set the tone for your entire relationship with your father's legacy." These people need to know what kind of leader you'll be, whether you'll use power to punish and control, or whether you'll find a different path. The words were a challenge and an invitation, asking Clarissa to define herself at the exact moment, when she had the most reason to choose vengeance over mercy. Clarissa moved to the window, looking out over the snow-covered streets of Manhattan, the city glittering in the darkness like a jewel box full of secrets and possibilities. Down below, luxury cars continued to arrive, drivers in uniform opening doors for guests who had no idea that the evening's social calculations were about to be completely overturned. She thought about her mother, that gentle woman who'd worked her fingers raw to provide a life of dignity, if not luxury, who'd taught patience and integrity even when the world rewarded neither. What would her mother want her to do with this power? How would Theodore Stanton, the father she'd never known, but whose values were spelled out in that letter, expect his daughter to wield the authority he'd left her? The answer came not as words, but as certainty settling in her bones, a clarity about who she was regardless of wealth or position. "I'm going downstairs," she said, turning back to face the room with new resolve. "I'm going to meet my father's people and begin understanding the responsibilities I've inherited. But before I do that, I need all of you to understand something." Her gaze moved between Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa with a weight of judgment that couldn't be argued away. "What happened here tonight doesn't disappear just because my circumstances changed. You revealed your true characters when you thought I had no power to challenge you, and that revelation matters more than any apology you might offer now." She saw Lenora start to protest and held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not interested in excuses or justifications. I'm interested in truth. You treated me as disposable because you thought I came from nothing, and that tells me everything I need to know about how you value human beings. My father's letter warned me about people exactly like you, and he was right to prepare me for this moment. How would you respond to people who showed you their worst selves and only regretted it when they discovered you had power? Would you trust their sudden change of heart, or would you remember exactly who they were when they thought you couldn't fight back?" Lenora rose from her chair with visible effort, her composure reassembling itself like armor being strapped back on after a devastating blow. "Clarissa, I won't pretend tonight didn't happen or that we don't deserve your anger. But I am asking you to consider the position you're putting this family in. Eric is your husband. Whatever happens between us affects him directly, affects any future you might build together." The appeal to marriage and loyalty was calculated, an attempt to bind Clarissa's choices to commitments made before she understood the full picture. Destroying the Van Halen reputation destroys your own position in society. People will talk, speculate about why Theodore Stanton's daughter married into a family she then systematically dismantled. Is that really how you want to begin your public life? The threat was subtle but clear, suggesting that mercy wasn't just moral but strategic, that vengeance would cost Clarissa as much as it cost them. But Clarissa had spent months studying the subtle violence of society politics, learning to read implications and threats disguised as concern, and she wasn't fooled by Lenora's sudden appeal to shared interests. "You're right that destroying your family would affect Eric," she acknowledged, seeing her husband flinch at the casual way she referenced his potential ruin. "But you're wrong about everything else. My father's legacy doesn't need the Van Halen name or your social connections. If anything, association with people who orchestrated tonight's cruelty would damage the foundations and enterprises he built on principles of dignity and respect." She moved closer to Lenora, her voice dropping but losing none of its steel. "You gambled that I was nobody, that my background made me weak and disposable. You lost that gamble spectacularly. Now you want me to pretend it never happened, to protect your reputation for the sake of a marriage you tried your best to destroy. Why would I do that?" Vanessa finally spoke, her voice small and stripped of its earlier confidence. "Because you're better than us," she said, the words sounding like they cost her everything to admit. "Because you could ruin us and you'd be justified, but that would make you just like every other wealthy person who uses power as a weapon. Your father's letter talked about character and choices. Maybe this is the moment where you prove you're his daughter in ways that go deeper than DNA." The appeal to Clarissa's better nature was transparent, but not entirely cynical. And for a moment something flickered in Vanessa's eyes that might have been genuine remorse, or might have been excellent acting. I was cruel tonight, because I wanted Eric, and I was jealous of what you had with him. That doesn't excuse anything, but it's the truth. And now I understand I was fighting for scraps, while you held the whole feast, without even knowing it. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head at her own miscalculation. I thought I was so smart, so strategic. Turns out I was just mean to someone who didn't deserve it, and powerful enough to destroy me for it. The admission was raw enough to feel authentic, and Clarissa found herself at a crossroads between justice and mercy, between teaching lessons through consequences and taking a higher road that might cost her the satisfaction of watching them suffer, as she'd suffered. Margaret Chun stepped forward, sensing the moment's importance. "Your father faced this choice many times," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed Theodore Stanton's character across decades. People underestimated him, tried to cheat him, positioned themselves to take advantage of his generosity. He could have crushed them, and sometimes he did when their actions caused real harm to innocent people. But more often, he gave them a chance to be better than their worst moment, to learn from their mistakes without being destroyed by them. She pulled out another document from her portfolio, this one simpler than the others. He left instructions about situations exactly like this. He said his daughter would face people who judged her before they knew her, who would treat her poorly based on assumptions about her worth. And he said the measure of her character would be found not in how she wielded power against them, but in whether she could see them clearly, hold them accountable, and still find a path forward that honored her own values rather than matching their cruelty. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of those words, the challenge they represented. Eric moved closer to Clarissa, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel his presence, the complicated history between them crackling in the small space that separated their bodies. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her, though everyone could hear in the study's charged atmosphere. "I don't even deserve the chance to earn it back. But if you're willing to show mercy, if you can find a way to hold us accountable without destroying everything, I promise I'll spend whatever time you give me proving that I can be better than the man who failed you tonight." His eyes were wet with unshed tears, his composure finally cracking under the weight of genuine understanding about what he'd lost and what he might never get back. "I love you," he added the words, sounding like a confession torn from somewhere deep. "I know I showed it poorly, know I chose wrong at every turn, but I do love you. And if you walk away from this marriage, from me, I'll understand completely. But I'm asking for a chance I don't deserve, hoping that somewhere in your heart there's room for the possibility that people can change when they finally see what they've been blind to." The vulnerability in his plea was either genuine or the best performance of his life, and Clarissa found herself unable to immediately distinguish between the two, her emotional landscape too complex, after months of betrayal and one evening of vindication to offer simple clarity. Clarissa looked at the three people who'd caused her so much pain, really looked at them, seeing not just the cruelty they'd inflicted, but the fear and regret that now consumed them. She thought about her mother, who'd chosen dignity over bitterness even when life gave her every reason to be angry, who'd taught that strength came from knowing when to fight and when to show grace. She thought about her father, a man she'd never known, but whose values were clear in the letter he'd left, in the instructions he'd given his attorneys, in the empire he'd built on principles that valued human dignity over profit. And she thought about who she wanted to be as she stepped into this new life, whether she would begin her public existence by becoming the kind of person who used power to wound, or the kind who found more creative paths to justice and accountability. "Here's what's going to happen," she said finally, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. "I'm going downstairs to meet my father's representatives and begin learning about the responsibilities I've inherited. The three of you are going to remain up here until I decide how to handle the public revelation of my identity." She saw relief flicker across their faces and held up a hand to stop premature gratitude. "But understand this clearly. What happened tonight doesn't go away. You showed me exactly who you are, and I won't forget that or pretend it didn't matter. If we find a way forward, it will be on terms that ensure nothing like this ever happens again. To me, or to anyone else you might be tempted to dismiss as unimportant. Her eyes moved to Eric specifically. You have a choice to make about what kind of man you want to be. The one who protects his wife's dignity, or the one who sacrifices it for his mother's approval. You can't be both, and I won't accept anything less than complete commitment to choosing differently than you chose tonight. She turned to Lenora with steel in her gaze. And you need to understand that your son's marriage is not your battlefield. If you can't treat me with respect, then you'll find yourself excluded from our lives entirely, regardless of how much that costs socially or emotionally. Finally, she looked at Vanessa with something close to pity. You wanted what I had without understanding what it was. Figure out who you are when you're not trying to take someone else's place, and maybe you'll find something worth having. The pronouncements delivered, Clarissa moved toward the door, where Margaretchen waited with approval evident in her expression. As she reached for the handle, she paused and looked back one final time. The party downstairs is about to change completely. When I walk into that room with my father's attorneys, everyone will understand who I really am. How that reflects on all of you depends on what happens in the next few minutes. How you compose yourselves, what story your faces tell when you eventually rejoin the gathering. Choose wisely, because this is the only chance you'll get to shape how this night is remembered. Clarissa descended the grand staircase with Margaretchen and the two other attorneys flanking her like an honor guard, their presence transforming her from dismissed outsider into something infinitely more significant before she'd spoken a single word. The party continued below in full swing, guests circulating through rooms filled with champagne and laughter, completely unaware that the social order they took for granted was about to undergo seismic reorganization. The string quartet still played in the main hall, their music providing an elegant soundtrack to conversations about business deals and vacation homes, charity galas and political maneuvering, the usual currency of Manhattan's elite exchanged with practiced ease. But as Clarissa appeared at the top of the stairs, something in the atmosphere shifted, conversations faltering as heads turned to track her movement, eyes widening as they registered not just her presence, but the quality of authority emanating from the attorneys surrounding her. Margaretchen carried herself with a kind of quiet power that came from managing billions and advising world leaders, and her visible deference to Clarissa sent immediate signals through the crowd that the evening's social calculations needed urgent recalibration. Clarissa felt every eye on her as she descended, measuring each step with deliberate care, her hand resting lightly on the banister while her other hand touched the gold necklace at her throat, drawing strength from that physical connection to the father who'd prepared for this moment even though he'd never lived to see it. The modest green dress that had been mocked earlier now seemed perfectly appropriate, its simplicity a stark contrast to the overblown elegance around her, making a statement about substance over spectacle that would only become clear in the minutes ahead. She could see guests whispering to each other, speculation rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, and she knew that somewhere in the study above, Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa were making their own calculations about how to survive what came next. The crowd parted as she reached the bottom of the stairs, creating an aisle that led directly to the center of the main hall, where Lenora had stood earlier, delivering her poisonous speech about maintaining standards and dealing with temporary intrusions. Clarissa walked that path with measured dignity, aware that this was theater as much as revelation, that how she presented herself in this moment would set the tone for every interaction that followed in her new life. Margaretchen moved slightly ahead, her voice carrying with practiced authority as she addressed the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. I'm Margaretchen, senior partner at Chun & Associates, and I have the honor this evening of introducing someone many of you have been eager to meet. The formality of her tone suggested significance beyond normal social presentation, and the crowd pressed closer, curious about what would merit such an announcement at a private Christmas party. For the past 6 months, my firm has been managing the estate of Theodore Stanton, whose passing earlier this year left a void in countless enterprises and foundations. As many of you know, Theodore never married publicly and was intensely private about his personal life, leading to considerable speculation about the distribution of his considerable fortune and the leadership of his various holdings. She paused, letting anticipation build, and Clarissa could see recognition dawning on some faces, connections being made between the name Stanton and her presence here with Theodore's personal attorneys. Tonight, I'm pleased to finally confirm what has been verified through extensive legal documentation and DNA analysis. Theodore Stanton had one child, a daughter born from a love affair he kept private to protect both mother and child from the pressures and dangers of public scrutiny. Margaret turned to Clarissa with a smile of genuine warmth. Mrs. Clarissa Van Halen, born Clarissa Duval, is Theodore Stanton's sole heir and beneficiary, inheriting not just his fortune, but his vision for how that wealth should be used to benefit society. She is, quite literally, one of the most powerful women in the world, though until this evening she herself was largely unaware of the full extent of her inheritance. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of shocked stillness that comes from having fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly overturned. Faces throughout the crowd reflected varying degrees of disbelief, calculation, and in some cases visible horror, as people remembered exactly how they'd treated Clarissa earlier in the evening, what dismissive comments they'd made, what judgments they'd passed. The society matrons who'd participated in her humiliation looked physically ill, their faces draining of color, as they understood they'd spent the evening mocking and excluding one of the wealthiest and most influential people on the planet. The men who dismissed her questions or spoken over her in conversations now stared with expressions mixing respect and fear, recalculating every interaction through the lens of power they hadn't known she possessed. And standing near the back of the room, several people Clarissa had never seen before began moving forward, their faces showing relief and something approaching joy as they recognized her as the person they'd been seeking for months. These were her father's people, representatives from his various enterprises who'd been trying to locate Theodore Stanton's missing daughter and bring her into the fold, and their presence confirmed Margaret's announcement with weight that couldn't be dismissed as elaborate hoax or social maneuvering. A distinguished older man with silver hair and kind eyes reached Clarissa first, extending his hand with warmth that felt genuine rather than strategic. "Miss Stanton," he said, his voice carrying emotion that suggested personal connection beyond business relationship. "I'm Robert Harrison, your father's closest friend and chairman of Stanton Industries. I knew your mother briefly many years ago, and I've been hoping to find you since your father's passing. He spoke of you often in his final years, though he respected your mother's wishes to keep your identity private until you were ready to claim your heritage." He clasped her hand in both of his grip warm and steady. "You look like him, you know. Same eyes, same way of watching everything carefully before speaking. He would be so proud of the woman you've become." The words landed like benediction, filling some hollow place inside Clarissa that she hadn't known existed until that moment. Here was a tangible connection to a father she'd never known, validation that he'd thought of her, cared about her, hoped for this eventual meeting, even knowing he wouldn't survive to see it. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm still processing all of this, still trying to understand what it means and what he expected of me." Robert smiled with understanding. He expected you to be yourself, nothing more and nothing less. Your mother raised you right, taught you values and character that no amount of money can buy. That's what he wanted most, for you to come into this wealth with your integrity intact, ready to use it for good rather than letting it corrupt you. He glanced around at the assembled crowd, many of whom were still staring with varying degrees of shock and calculation. "Though I suspect tonight has provided some education about human nature that your father knew you'd eventually receive. People show their true colors when they think you have no power to challenge them, don't they?" The question carried weight that suggested he understood exactly what had transpired earlier in the evening, and Clarissa wondered how much of tonight's cruelty would become public knowledge, how the story would spread through Manhattan social circles, and what consequences would follow for those who'd participated in her systematic humiliation. Other representatives from Stanton's empire began introducing themselves, each one carrying pieces of her father's story and her own heritage, their presence surrounding her with a protection and authority she'd never experienced before. They spoke of foundations focused on education and poverty relief, technology companies pioneering sustainable solutions, real estate holdings that prioritized affordable housing alongside luxury development, a vast network of enterprises and initiatives all designed to create positive change while generating the wealth that made such change possible. This was her inheritance, not just money, but responsibility, a legacy built on principles her mother had taught her from childhood, without either of them knowing those lessons were preparing her for exactly this moment. A woman in her 40s, with sharp intelligence in her eyes and documents tucked under her arm, approached with professional efficiency. Miss Stanton, I'm Patricia Moreland, Chief Operating Officer of the Stanton Foundation. We've been operating under interim leadership since your father's death, but there are decisions that require the founder's heir to make, initiatives that need your approval to move forward. She opened one of the folders, showing Clarissa pages of proposals and budgets, opportunities and challenges that represented real impact on thousands of lives. Your father believed that wealth carried an obligation, that those who had much owed much to those who had little. He structured everything to ensure that even if he died unexpectedly, his resources would continue flowing toward causes he cared about. But he also wanted his heir to have full authority to shape that vision, to add their own priorities and values to the work. Patricia's eyes held both hope and assessment, clearly evaluating whether Theodore Stanton's daughter would prove worthy of the empire he'd left her. We can schedule proper meetings to go through everything in detail, but I wanted you to know that hundreds of projects are waiting for your guidance. Thousands of people are depending on decisions only you can make now. The weight of that responsibility settled over Clarissa like a mantle. Heavy, but not crushing. Significant, but not paralyzing. This was what her mother had been preparing her for, without either of them fully understanding it. This moment when character mattered more than credentials. When values determined the direction of resources that could literally change the world. How would you handle suddenly discovering you controlled resources that could solve problems you'd witnessed, but felt powerless to fix? Would you trust yourself with that kind of responsibility, or would you be terrified of making mistakes that affected so many lives? The crowd's energy had shifted from shocked silence to buzzing speculation. Guests clustering in small groups to process the revelation and calculate its implications for their own positions and interests. Clarissa could see the society women who'd mocked her earlier huddled together, their faces showing various stages of panic, as they realized the social suicide they'd committed by participating in the humiliation of Theodore Stanton's daughter. Men who dismissed her as insignificant were now positioning themselves to catch her eye, hoping for a chance to introduce themselves properly and erase earlier slights through sheer force of belated respect. And threading through it all was the electric awareness that power had fundamentally redistributed itself in this room, that the woman standing in the center, surrounded by her father's trusted advisors, now held more influence than everyone else combined, that alliances and hierarchies that had seemed permanent an hour ago were now negotiable based on one person's choices. Margaret Chin moved close to Clarissa, her voice low but clear. They're circling like sharks who smell blood in the water, trying to figure out how to position themselves advantageously now that they understand who you are. This is the moment where you establish boundaries, where you teach them that your power isn't available for exploitation just because they suddenly want access to it. She gestured subtly toward the various groups forming and reforming across the room. Some of these people participated in tonight's cruelty. Others simply stood by and watched. And a few tried to show you kindness even when they thought you were nobody. Remember who did what, because they've all shown you their character when they thought you couldn't afford to care about it. The advice was strategic, but also moral, reminding Clarissa that this moment wasn't just about claiming power, but about how she chose to wield it, what precedents she set for every interaction that would follow in her new public life. A commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention, and Clarissa turned to see Eric descending the stairs with Lenora and Vanessa trailing behind him, all three looking like they'd aged years in the minutes since she'd left them in the study. Eric's face was set with determination mixed with visible fear, his posture suggesting a man who'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through even if it destroyed him. Lenora had regained some of her composure, but couldn't quite hide the panic in her eyes. the understanding that her social position and influence had just become dependent on the mercy of a woman she'd spent months trying to break. And Vanessa looked smaller somehow, her earlier confidence completely stripped away, leaving behind someone who understood she'd gambled everything on the wrong outcome, and now faced consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. The crowd parted as they approached, curious about how this confrontation would unfold. Whether Theodore Stanton's daughter would publicly destroy the family that had treated her so poorly, or whether she'd show restraint that most people in her position wouldn't even consider. Eric reached Clarissa first, and for a long moment they simply stood looking at each other. Years of history, and the evening's revelations hanging between them like smoke that hadn't yet cleared. "Clarissa," he said, his voice carrying to nearby guests, but clearly meant for her alone. "I need to say something publicly, something I should have said months ago." He took a breath that seemed to cost him everything, then spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I've been a coward and a fool. I married a woman of extraordinary character and intelligence, and instead of protecting her dignity and defending her worth, I allowed her to be systematically diminished by people who should have welcomed her with open arms." His eyes never left hers as he continued, words tumbling out with the desperation of someone who knew this might be his only chance to say them. "I chose my mother's approval over my wife's happiness. I stood silent while she was mocked and excluded. I prioritized social comfort over moral obligation. And tonight, I learned that the woman I failed to defend is someone the entire world would recognize as extraordinary. Someone who didn't need my family's acceptance because she came from something infinitely greater." He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "But none of that should matter. You deserve to be treated with respect and love, regardless of who your father was or what inheritance you might claim. The fact that I only see that clearly now, only understand what I lost by failing you after learning you're Theodore Stanton's daughter, tells me everything about my own character that I need to work to change." The public confession was either genuine remorse or calculated damage control, and Clarissa found herself unable to immediately distinguish between the two, her emotions too complex after everything that had happened to offer simple clarity. Lenora stepped forward before Clarissa could respond, her face showing the effort it cost her to speak words she'd probably never imagined having to say. "Clarissa, I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express. I judged you based on circumstances of birth that have nothing to do with character or worth. I orchestrated cruelty against you because I believed you weren't good enough for my son, when in truth you were far too good for how we treated you." Her voice wavered slightly, genuine emotion breaking through practiced composure. "I told myself I was protecting family standards, maintaining traditions, but the truth is I was protecting my own position and authority by making you feel small. That was wrong, inexcusable, and I will spend whatever time you allow me trying to earn back even a fraction of the respect I destroyed tonight." The apology was complicated, mixing genuine remorse with clear understanding that her family's future depended on Clarissa's response, that social and possibly financial consequences would follow if Theodore Stanton's daughter declared the Van Halens her enemies. Vanessa remained slightly behind them, her face showing that she understood her position was most precarious of all, the mistress who'd actively campaigned to replace a wife who turned out to be infinitely more powerful than anyone had imagined. "I have no excuse for my behavior," she said quietly, her earlier boldness completely absent. "I was jealous and cruel, and I deserve whatever consequences follow from that. I can only say that I'm sorry and that I'll stay completely out of your lives if that's what you need." The three of them stood before Clarissa like defendants awaiting verdict, and every eye in the room was locked on her face, waiting to see what Theodore Stanton's daughter would do with the power she'd finally claimed, whether she would use it to destroy those who'd wronged her or find some other path that none of them could yet imagine. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Clarissa stood at the center of Manhattan's elite, surrounded by her father's trusted advisors, while her husband, mother-in-law, and her husband's mistress waited for judgment that would determine not just their personal futures, but their entire social existence. The moment stretched like glass being pulled to its breaking point, every face in the crowd reflecting various calculations about what came next, what allegiances would prove wise, what reactions would be remembered when the dust finally settled. Clarissa felt the weight of expectation pressing down from all sides, the audience wanting drama and retribution, wanting to see the woman who'd been humiliated rise up and crush those who'd wronged her with the devastating finality that money and power made possible. It would be so easy to give them that show, to let righteous anger guide her words, and watch the Van Halen empire crumble under the weight of social consequences that would follow Theodore Stanton's daughter, declaring them her enemies. But as she stood there feeling every eye on her, her hand touched the gold necklace at her throat, and she heard her mother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside her. That gentle wisdom about strength being found in choosing dignity over vengeance, about power being most impressive when wielded with restraint rather than rage. Her father's letter had warned her about exactly this moment, about people showing their true nature when they thought she was powerless. And he'd trusted her to handle that truth with wisdom that honored his legacy rather than simply adding to the world's cruelty. The choice before her wasn't just about Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa. It was about defining who she would be as she stepped into this new life, what kind of leader she'd become, whether she'd use her inheritance to heal or to wound. "I believe some introductions are overdue," Clarissa said finally, her voice cutting through the silence with clarity that commanded absolute attention. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests, landing on faces that had dismissed her, mocked her, treated her as invisible just hours before. "My name is Clarissa Duval Van Halen, and as you've just learned, I am Theodore Stanton's daughter and sole heir to his fortune and vision." She paused, letting that reality settle deeper into the room's consciousness. "Until tonight, I didn't fully understand what that inheritance meant beyond the legal documents and financial statements. But this evening has provided an education more valuable than any balance sheet could offer." She gestured toward the crowd with a movement that encompassed all of them, making everyone complicit in what had transpired. "Some of you participated actively in humiliating me tonight. You made comments about my clothes, my background, my supposed unsuitability for the Van Halen family and this social circle. You positioned me at the back of rooms, excluded me from conversations, treated me like an embarrassment that needed to be tolerated rather than a person deserving basic dignity." Her words were measured but devastating, each one landing with precision that made guilty parties flinch. "Others of you simply watched it happen. You saw cruelty unfolding and chose silence, either because you agreed with the judgment being passed, or because standing up for someone you thought was powerless seemed risky or uncomfortable." The accusation spread wider, implicating not just the active participants, but the passive observers who'd allowed the evening's systematic degradation to continue unchallenged. "And a very few of you tried to show kindness even when you thought I was nobody, even when you believed there was nothing to gain from treating me with respect." Her eyes found those faces in the crowd, people who'd offered genuine smiles or simple courtesy when it would have been easier to join the mockery. And she nodded acknowledgement that they'd been seen and their character noted. "Tonight has shown me exactly who values human dignity for its own sake, and who only performs respect when they think there's power behind it to demand such treatment." The moral clarity of her position was unassailable, and even those who'd wronged her couldn't argue with the truth she was speaking. Margaretchen stood slightly behind Clarissa, her presence a reminder of the institutional power now backing every word, the legal and financial machinery that could make consequences very real for anyone Theodore Stanton's daughter chose to oppose. Robert Harrison had moved closer as well, his distinguished presence adding weight to the moment, his expression showing approval of how Clarissa was handling her first public appearance as her father's heir. Theodore Stanton built his empire on the principle that wealth carried an obligation, that those who had much owed much to those who had little, Clarissa continued, her voice strengthening as she found her rhythm. He believed in dignity for all people regardless of their circumstances, in opportunity for those the world had written off, in using power to lift others up rather than pressing them down. That was his vision, and it's the legacy he left me to continue. She turned to face Eric, Lenora, and Vanessa directly, her expression neither angry nor forgiving, but something more complex that defied easy categorization. What happened here tonight was a perfect example of everything my father stood against. You judged me as less than because I came from modest circumstances. You dismissed my worth because I didn't have the right pedigree or connections. You orchestrated systematic humiliation to put me in what you considered my proper place. The words laid out their crimes with surgical precision, each accusation irrefutable, because dozens of witnesses had seen exactly what she described. And then you discovered I came from somewhere that made your wealth and influence look insignificant by comparison. And suddenly you're apologizing, claiming remorse, asking for mercy you never showed when you thought I couldn't fight back. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many of them recognizing their own behavior in Clarissa's description, understanding that her judgment applied far beyond just the three people standing before her. Eric's face showed genuine anguish, the kind of pain that came from seeing yourself clearly for the first time and hating what you discovered. Lenora maintained her composure with visible effort. Years of social training, the only thing preventing complete breakdown in front of everyone whose opinion she'd spent a lifetime cultivating. And Vanessa looked utterly defeated, her earlier beauty dimmed by shame and fear, understanding that her calculated cruelty had cost her everything she'd been fighting for. The easy response would be to destroy you, Clarissa said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness because every ear in the room was straining to catch her words. My father's resources could make you social pariahs overnight. One phone call could cost you business relationships, board positions, access to circles you've considered your birthright. I could make an example of you so devastating that no one would ever dare treat Theodore Stanton's daughter with anything less than absolute deference. She paused, and the crowd leaned forward unconsciously, desperate to know which path she'd choose. But that would make me exactly like you, using power as a weapon to crush people I judged as lesser. And I refuse to let your cruelty change who I am or corrupt the values my mother spent a lifetime teaching me. The moral high ground she claimed was unassailable, and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people absorbed the implications of mercy when vengeance would have been justified. So here's what's going to happen, Clarissa continued, her voice taking on an edge of steel that suggested this was judgment rather than forgiveness, accountability rather than erasure of consequences. Eric, you and I will be having many difficult conversations about whether this marriage can survive the betrayals of the past months. I'm not promising reconciliation or forgiveness, only that I'm willing to see if the man who just made that public apology can become the husband who defends his wife's dignity as fiercely as he's protected his mother's authority. She saw hope flicker in Eric's eyes mixed with understanding that he'd be proving himself for a long time. Lenora, you will no longer have any authority over my life or my choices. If Eric and I find a way forward, you'll be part of our lives only to the extent that you can treat me with genuine respect, not the performance of respect you're offering now that you know who my father was. Lenora's face tightened, but she nodded acceptance, understanding that her position had fundamentally changed and that fighting would only make things worse. And Vanessa, Clarissa turned to face the woman who'd been most actively cruel. You're going to leave this house tonight and stay out of Eric's life completely. Whatever you thought you were building toward, it's over. Find your own identity instead of trying to steal someone else's place. The pronouncement was final, delivered without anger, but with absolute authority, and Vanessa nodded once before turning toward the door, her exit watched by dozens of eyes that would spread the story of her banishment through society by morning. What would you do if you had the power to destroy people who'd wronged you, but chose mercy instead? Would you trust that showing restraint made you stronger, or would you worry that people would see forgiveness as weakness to exploit? The crowd's energy shifted dramatically as Clarissa's judgment took effect, conversations erupting in hushed tones as guests processed what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't the bloodbath many had expected, the public destruction that Manhattan society thrived on witnessing and discussing for months afterward. Instead, they'd seen something rarer and more unsettling, power wielded with restraint that somehow made it more impressive rather than less. Mercy offered not from weakness, but from strength secure enough not to need vengeance. The society matrons who'd participated in Clarissa's humiliation looked shaken, understanding that while she'd chosen not to destroy them publicly, She now knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of when they thought no one powerful was watching. Men who dismissed her earlier were repositioning themselves carefully, trying to catch her eye without seeming desperate, hoping for a chance to demonstrate they could be counted among those who valued character over circumstances. And threading through it all was electric awareness that the social order had fundamentally shifted, that the woman standing in the center of this gilded ballroom now held more power than everyone else combined, and had just demonstrated she knew how to use it strategically rather than emotionally. Robert Harrison moved to Clarissa's side. His voice pitched for her ears alone, though several people nearby strained to overhear. "Your father would be incredibly proud of how you handled that," he said, genuine emotion coloring his words. "You found the narrow path between being a doormat and being a tyrant, showing strength without cruelty and mercy without weakness. That's harder than it looks, and most people with sudden power never manage it." He glanced at the crowd, assessing reactions with decades of experience reading social dynamics. "You've established yourself as someone who keeps accounts but doesn't seek vengeance. Someone who remembers both kindness and cruelty, but responds with strategy rather than emotion. That's going to serve you well as you take over your father's various enterprises and foundations. People will respect you, but they'll also trust you, which is rarer and more valuable." Margaret joined them, her expression showing satisfaction with how the evening had unfolded despite its rocky beginning. "We should schedule meetings starting next week to begin your education about all the moving pieces of your inheritance. There are boards that need direction, foundations waiting for strategic guidance, investments requiring decisions that will affect thousands of jobs and lives. It's overwhelming, but you have your father's entire team ready to support you through the learning process." She handed Clarissa a business card with contact information embossed in elegant script. "Call my office tomorrow, and we'll set up the calendar. For tonight, you should probably circulate a bit. Let people reintroduce themselves now that they understand who you are. First impressions may be powerful, but how you handle this moment will shape every relationship going forward." Clarissa nodded, accepting the card and the advice, but before she could move into the crowd, a small commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A woman in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair was making her way through the assembled guests, her movement creating ripples of recognition and respect that suggested someone of significant status. People stepped aside to let her pass, offering greetings that she acknowledged with brief nods, but without stopping her progress toward Clarissa. "Eleanor Whitmore," Margaret whispered quickly. "She was your father's mentor early in his career, one of the few people whose opinion he truly valued. If she's here, it's because she wanted to meet you herself." The woman reached Clarissa and stood studying her for a long moment, her gaze searching and assessing in ways that felt more grandmotherly than calculating. "You have your father's eyes," she said finally, her voice carrying warmth that felt genuine. "And from what I just witnessed, you have his character too. Theodore told me about you years ago, swore to secrecy, but couldn't help sharing his joy that he had a daughter, even if he couldn't be part of your life the way he wanted." She reached out and took both of Clarissa's hands in hers, the gesture intimate and caring. "Your mother raised you beautifully. He knew she would. And tonight you proved that a good character doesn't need wealth to develop, though having wealth makes it much easier to express the character on a larger scale." Eleanor glanced at Eric, Lenora, and the dispersing crowd with an expression mixing amusement and approval. "You could have destroyed them, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you held them accountable, while leaving space for growth and change. That's wisdom beyond your years, and it's exactly what your father hoped you'd bring to his legacy." She squeezed Clarissa's hands once more before releasing them. "I'm hosting a small dinner next week for people who know Theodore well and want to meet his daughter properly. I hope you'll come. We have stories to share about your father, insights into who he was beyond the public persona, things that might help you understand the inheritance you've received." The invitation was clearly significant, a stamp of approval from someone whose opinion carried weight in circles that went deeper than Manhattan society's surface glamour. The evening continued with transformed energy as Clarissa moved through the crowd, accepting introductions and reintroductions with grace that came partly from her mother's training and partly from her own natural dignity, finally given space to breathe. People who dismissed her earlier now competed for moments of her attention, their conversations carefully calibrated to demonstrate respect without seeming obsequious, interest without appearing desperate for favor. She could feel the difference in how they treated her now versus 3 hours ago, the shift from casual dismissal to careful deference. And while part of her was satisfied by the reversal, another part mourned the lost possibility of ever knowing which of these people might have valued her for herself rather than what she represented. Children who'd been positioned earlier to demonstrate their parent status now approached with genuine curiosity, their questions innocent and disarming. "Are you really one of the richest people in the world?" a young girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "My mom says you could buy anything you wanted." Clarissa knelt to meet the child's eyes, remembering her own humble childhood and the values that had shaped her. "I suppose I could buy many things," she acknowledged. "But the most important things in life can't be bought. Kindness, integrity, real friendship, genuine love. Those you have to earn through how you treat people and who you choose to be." The answer was simple but profound, and she saw several adults nearby listening with expressions suggesting they understood the lesson was meant for them as much as for the child. As midnight approached and guests began departing, Clarissa found herself standing once again by the window where she'd spent so much of the evening in isolation, but now the view felt completely different. The snow still fell in thick silence, covering Manhattan in white peace, but she was no longer watching from the outside. She'd claimed her place at the center, not through aggression or cruelty, but through dignity and strategic mercy that made her power more impressive for its restraint. Eric approached hesitantly, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty that suggested genuine humility rather than calculated performance. "Thank you," he said quietly, standing beside her but not touching, respecting the distance she created. "For not destroying us when you had every right to. For giving me a chance I don't deserve to prove I can be better." Clarissa turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing both the man she'd married and the stranger who'd betrayed her through silence and inaction. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "The hard work is just beginning. You have to figure out who you are when your mother's approval isn't guiding your choices, when standing up for what's right costs you comfort and ease. That's going to take time and effort, and there's no guarantee we'll make it through. But I'm willing to try if you're genuinely committed to change." She paused, her eyes holding him with intensity that demanded truth. "Just understand this clearly. I'm Theodore Stanton's daughter now, publicly and permanently. That means my life will never be simple or private again. There will be constant demands on my time and attention, difficult decisions about resources that affect thousands of lives, scrutiny from people looking for any sign of weakness or poor judgment. If you're going to be my husband through all of that, you need to be my genuine partner and defender, not a silent observer who disappears when things get uncomfortable." The challenge was clear, the terms non-negotiable, and Eric nodded slowly, understanding that he was essentially courting his own wife again, trying to earn a place beside her that he'd nearly destroyed through his earlier failures. Outside, snow continued to fall in perfect silence, covering the city in white that made everything look clean and new, possibility and redemption offered to a world that rarely gave second chances, but sometimes, just sometimes, allowed people to rise from their worst moments into something better than they'd been before. The transformation of the Christmas gala from orchestrated humiliation into public coronation sent shockwaves that rippled outward from the Van Halen mansion with the force of an earthquake, reshaping familiar terrain into something unrecognizable. Within hours, the story was spreading through Manhattan's elite circles with a velocity that only genuine scandal could achieve. Text messages flying between society matrons, phone calls connecting board members and business partners, whispered conversations in exclusive clubs where membership cost more than most people's homes. The basic facts were simple enough. Theodore Stanton's previously unknown daughter had been hiding in plain sight as Eric Van Halen's dismissed wife. But the implications were seismic and constantly unfolding as people realized what this meant for social hierarchies, business relationships, and the careful balance of power that governed their world. Clarissa stood at the center of this storm with a calm that came from finally understanding her own worth, from recognizing that the months of humiliation had been terrible, but also clarifying, showing her exactly who people were when they thought she had no power to hold them accountable. The days following the revelation became a masterclass in watching people recalibrate their positions, some with grace and others with transparent desperation, all of them trying to figure out how to navigate a landscape where the woman they'd dismissed now held more influence than anyone they'd ever encountered. Margaret Chen's office was coordinating everything with military precision, scheduling meetings with board members and foundation directors, arranging interviews with key stakeholders in her father's various enterprises, creating structure around what could easily have become overwhelming chaos. "You're handling this remarkably well," Margaret observed during their third meeting in as many days, her tone mixing professional assessment with genuine admiration. Most people who come into sudden wealth and power either become paralyzed by indecision or drunk on authority. You're doing neither. You're asking smart questions, listening carefully to advice, and making decisions that honor your father's values while adding your own perspective. She pushed another folder across the conference table, this one containing proposals from various charities seeking funding from the Stanton Foundation. These are the kinds of choices you'll be making constantly now. Every decision affects real people's lives, and there's never enough money to fund everything worthy. So you have to develop your own criteria for what matters most. Clarissa opened the folder and scanned the proposals, seeing requests for education programs, medical research, housing initiatives, environmental protection, each one compelling and backed by statistics about lives that could be changed with proper resources. "How did my father decide?" she asked, looking up at Margaret with genuine curiosity about the man she'd never known, but whose legacy now shaped every aspect of her existence. Margaret smiled with memory, softening her usually sharp features. He always asked the same question about every proposal. Will this give people tools to improve their own lives, or will it make them dependent on continued charity? He believed in empowerment over handouts, in creating systems that lifted people up rather than just making their poverty more comfortable. He wasn't cold about it, understood that sometimes people needed immediate help before they could build toward self-sufficiency, but he always prioritized long-term solutions over short-term relief. She tapped one of the proposals, a job training program for formerly incarcerated individuals. This is the kind of thing he loved. It addresses a real problem, provides practical skills, and creates pathways out of cycles that trap people for generations. The success rate is high, the cost per person is reasonable, and the social impact extends beyond just the individuals directly served. Clarissa read through the proposal carefully, recognizing the logic behind her father's approach and feeling it resonate with values her mother had taught her about dignity and self-determination. "Fund it," she said decisively, signing the approval form with authority that was becoming more natural each time she exercised it. "And let's visit the program sometime soon. I want to understand how it works on the ground and meet the people whose lives we're affecting." Margaret made notes with satisfaction, showing in her efficient movements. "Your father did that too, insisting on seeing programs in person rather than just reading reports. He said numbers told you what happened, but faces told you why it mattered." The connection to a father she'd never met, but kept discovering through his choices and values, felt like building a relationship backward through time, understanding him through the legacy he'd left rather than through shared experiences. Robert Harrison had been equally instrumental in helping Clarissa navigate the business side of her inheritance, introducing her to executives and board members who ran the various Stanton enterprises with competence her father had trusted enough to leave them in place. "The key thing to understand," Robert explained during a tour of Stanton Industries headquarters, "is that your father built teams of excellent people and then gave them autonomy to do their jobs well. He didn't micromanage or second-guess experts in their fields. He set the overall vision and values, made sure everyone understood the principles that should guide decisions, and then stepped back to let talented people execute." They walked through offices where hundreds of employees worked on projects ranging from sustainable technology development to affordable housing construction, each person contributing to enterprises that generated billions while supposedly serving purposes beyond mere profit. Your role isn't to run everything directly. It's to maintain that vision, to ensure that as these companies grow and change, they don't lose sight of why your father created them in the first place. You're the guardian of values more than the manager of operations. The distinction made sense to Clarissa, aligning with her own strengths and limitations, allowing her to contribute meaningfully without pretending expertise she didn't possess. The social ripples of her revelation continued expanding in ways both predictable and surprising. Lenora had retreated almost completely from public life in the immediate aftermath, her power base eroded by association with the catastrophic error of humiliating Theodore Stanton's daughter. Invitations that would normally flow to the Van Halen matriarch had dried up overnight as society hostesses calculated that including Lenora might offend Clarissa, and that offense could cost them access to resources and influence they desperately wanted to maintain. Eric reported that his mother was devastated, but also perhaps learning something from the experience. Her usual imperious confidence replaced by genuine uncertainty about her place in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. She asked about you yesterday, Eric told Clarissa over breakfast one morning, their first meal together since the gala, where they'd attempted something approaching normal marital conversation. Wanted to know if you'd be willing to meet with her privately, away from social pressure or public performance. She said she needs to understand how to be in your life, if you'll allow her to be at all. The request was vulnerable in ways Lenora had never been before, and Clarissa found herself considering it with more openness than she would have imagined possible just days earlier. Tell her I'll meet her for coffee next week, Clarissa decided, seeing relief flash across Eric's face. But make it clear this isn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. It's about establishing boundaries and expectations for how we interact going forward. She gets one chance to show me she understands how fundamentally things have changed. Eric nodded, reaching across the table as if to take her hand before stopping himself, still uncertain about physical contact after months of distance and the evening's revelations. Thank you, he said quietly, for giving her that chance, for giving us both chances we don't deserve. Clarissa didn't respond immediately, still working through her own feelings about whether this marriage could survive its foundational betrayals, whether trust once broken so thoroughly could ever be rebuilt into something sustainable and genuine. The emergence of her father's hidden allies had been one of the revelation's most satisfying developments. People Clarissa had never heard of began appearing in her life, introducing themselves as longtime friends of Theodore Stanton, who'd promised to watch over his daughter from a distance if anything happened to him. Eleanor Whitmore's dinner had been the first of several gatherings where Clarissa met individuals who'd known her father well, who could share stories about his character and choices, who offered perspective on the man whose legacy she'd inherited. He talked about you constantly in those last years, a distinguished surgeon told her over wine at Eleanor's elegant apartment. Show us pictures your mother sent. Read us updates about your achievements, even though they seemed modest by wealthy standards. He was so proud that you'd been raised with integrity, that you understood the value of work and treated people with respect regardless of their position. He said those qualities were rarer and more precious than any amount of money could buy. The stories accumulated into a portrait of a man who'd loved deeply and lost tragically, who'd honored his lover's wish to raise their daughter away from wealth's complications, even though it cost him the relationship he wanted most. Patricia Moreland from the Stanton Foundation had proven particularly valuable, her sharp intelligence and deep knowledge of her father's philanthropic vision making her an ideal guide through the complex landscape of charitable work. Your father believed that poverty wasn't primarily about lacking money, Patricia explained during a visit to a foundation-funded community center. It was about lacking access, opportunity, networks, and information. Rich people's children succeed not just because they inherit wealth, but because they inherit connections, education, social capital that opens doors before they even knock. He wanted his foundations to level that playing field, to give talented kids from poor backgrounds the same advantages wealthy children took for granted. They watched teenagers working on computers in a bright, well-equipped lab, learning coding skills that could transform their economic futures. Programs like this change trajectories. A kid who might have ended up in prison instead becomes a software engineer, supports their family, mentors the next generation. That ripple effect is what your father was after. Sustainable change rather than temporary relief. Clarissa felt her commitment to this work deepening with each site visit, each story about lives transformed, each recognition that her inheritance wasn't just wealth, but responsibility to use that wealth strategically and well. The Van Halen mansion itself had become strange territory. Rooms that had witnessed her humiliation now serving as backdrop for her transformation. Staff who'd followed Lenora's lead in dismissing Clarissa now treated her with careful respect that mixed genuine adjustment with transparent self-preservation. She'd kept most of them on, understanding that their earlier behavior reflected the household's power dynamics rather than personal cruelty. But she'd also made clear that how they treated people going forward would determine their continued employment. Everyone gets one fresh start, she told them during a staff meeting. Eric had been shocked she'd called. I'm not interested in punishing you for following orders or reading social cues about how I should be treated. But going forward, I expect every person in this house to be treated with dignity regardless of their position or perceived importance. If you can do that, we'll get along fine. If you can't, you should start looking for other positions now. The directness of her approach had been refreshing, clearing air that had been thick with anxiety and uncertainty, establishing new norms that reflected her values rather than Lenora's hierarchical obsessions. Eric was struggling to find his place in this transformed landscape. His earlier confidence revealed as largely performance backed by his mother's authority and family money that now seemed insignificant compared to Clarissa's inheritance. I don't know how to be your husband anymore, he admitted one evening as they stood together on the balcony outside their bedroom. The city glittering below them with lights that represented millions of lives, problems, possibilities. Everything I thought I brought to this marriage, status and connections and financial security. You don't need any of it. And the things you do need, emotional support and genuine partnership and someone who'll defend you regardless of social cost. I failed to provide when it mattered. His honesty was painful but necessary, the kind of truth-telling their marriage had lacked from its beginning. So figure out who you are when you're not performing status, Clarissa replied, her voice gentle but firm. Find what you actually value, what you want to contribute to the world, beyond managing inherited wealth and attending the right parties. I can't tell you how to be my husband. You have to discover that yourself, and I have to see if the man you discover is someone I can build a life with. The challenge was daunting, but Eric was facing it with more genuine effort than she'd seen from him before, and she found herself cautiously hopeful that maybe, possibly, they could forge something real from the wreckage of what they'd started with. What would you do if your partner finally stepped up after failing you when it mattered most? Would you trust their transformation, or would you always wonder when they might fail you again? 3 months after the Christmas Eve revelation, Clarissa stood in the Stanton Foundation boardroom overlooking Manhattan. The city spread beneath her like a living map of possibility and responsibility. Every light representing lives her decisions would touch in ways both immediate and rippling outward through generations. The room behind her hummed with quiet conversation as board members gathered for the quarterly meeting. Her first time chairing the assembly that guided billions in charitable resources toward problems her father had spent decades identifying and addressing. Margaret Chun was reviewing final agenda items, Patricia Moreland was organizing presentation materials, and Robert Harrison stood near the window offering quiet encouragement with his presence alone. These people who'd known Theodore Stanton becoming the family she'd never had. The connection to a father she understood better with each passing day through the legacy he'd built and the values he'd embedded in everything he touched. The transformation from dismissed wife to acknowledged heiress had been swift in calendar terms, but felt like a lifetime compressed into weeks. Every day bringing new responsibilities and revelations. Every decision teaching her something about power and its proper use. Every interaction revealing character in herself and others that might have remained hidden if circumstances hadn't forced such dramatic exposure. She'd learned that her father's empire was built on careful attention to detail, strategic patience, and genuine concern for human dignity that wasn't performance but conviction. Principles that resonated deeply with everything her mother had taught her during those modest years when they'd had little money but enormous reserves of integrity and love. The meeting began with routine business, budget reviews, and program updates that Clarissa followed with attention that surprised board members accustomed to wealthy heirs treating foundation work as vanity project rather than serious responsibility. She asked sharp questions that revealed she'd done her homework, challenged assumptions when proposals seemed more focused on appearing charitable than actually solving problems, and demonstrated the kind of engaged leadership her father had been known for before his death left these enterprises searching for direction they'd finally found in his daughter. The education initiative in Detroit is showing remarkable results, Patricia reported, pulling up slides that showed graduation rates climbing and college admissions increasing in neighborhoods where both had been abysmal just 3 years earlier. We're seeing exactly the kind of trajectory change your father hoped for when he funded this program. Kids who were expected to drop out are instead becoming the first in their families to attend university. Clarissa studied the data carefully, seeing beyond numbers to the individual lives represented, the futures transformed by resources applied strategically rather than scattered without purpose. "What's the sustainability plan?" she asked, knowing her father would have insisted programs prove they could maintain impact beyond initial funding bursts. "Can these schools continue the work if our foundation support decreases over time?" Patricia nodded with approval at the question. "We're building local leadership and establishing funding partnerships with businesses that benefit from a better educated workforce. In 5 years, they should be largely self-sustaining. That's always been the goal." The answer satisfied Clarissa's concern about creating dependency rather than empowerment, and she approved continued funding with confidence that it aligned with principles she was still learning but already understood as fundamental to her father's vision and her own emerging philosophy about how wealth should serve the world. The meeting continued through various initiatives and decisions, each one representing choices that would affect thousands of lives, and Clarissa felt the weight of that responsibility not as burden but as purpose, the kind of meaningful work her mother had always told her mattered more than money or status. When the formal business concluded, Robert Harrison stood to address the room with the gravitas that came from decades of friendship with Theodore Stanton and deep respect for what he'd built. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge what we've all witnessed these past 3 months," he said, his voice carrying emotion that professional reserve couldn't quite contain. Clarissa has stepped into her father's legacy with grace, intelligence, and moral clarity that Theodore would have recognized immediately because he saw those qualities developing in her from afar, trusted her mother to nurture them, and believed they would serve her well when the time came to claim her inheritance. He paused, looking directly at Clarissa with warmth that felt genuinely paternal. "You've exceeded even his considerable expectations. You've taken on enormous responsibility without being overwhelmed, wielded substantial power without being corrupted by it, and demonstrated that character shaped by modest circumstances often proves stronger than privilege that's never been tested. Your father would be extraordinarily proud, and so am I." The words landed like benediction, filling spaces inside Clarissa that had been empty since her mother's death, providing connection to the father she'd never known but was learning to honor through choices that reflected shared values. The board members applauded, their respect evident not just in the gesture but in their faces. These accomplished individuals, who'd initially been skeptical about Theodore Stanton's unknown daughter, now fully convinced she was worthy of the inheritance she'd claimed and capable of carrying forward work that mattered more than most of them would accomplish in entire lifetimes. After the meeting concluded and others had departed, Eleanor Whitmore lingered, her aged grace and sharp intelligence making her presence always worth whatever time she required. "Walk with me," she invited, and Clarissa followed her to the Foundation's library, a room lined with books Theodore had collected and annotated, his thoughts preserved in margins that offered glimpses into how his mind worked. "Your father used to say that wealth was a test of character more searching than poverty," Eleanor said, running her fingers along leather spines with the familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time in this space. "Poor people dream about what they do with money, But wealthy people have to actually make those choices, live with consequences of using power well or poorly. He believed most people failed that test, that comfort and privilege dulled the empathy and moral clarity that adversity sharpened. She pulled a volume from the shelf and handed it to Clarissa, a journal filled with Theodore's handwriting. Private thoughts never meant for public consumption. He left this for you specifically. Told me to give it to you once you'd settled into the work and proven you understood what mattered. It's his reflections on mistakes he made, lessons he learned, advice he wanted to pass to a daughter he couldn't raise directly. The gift was precious beyond monetary value, a bridge across time connecting her to the father she'd grieved without ever knowing, and Clarissa accepted it with hands that trembled slightly from the weight of intimacy this represented. The journal became her constant companion over the following weeks, Theodore's voice emerging from pages filled with observations about business and charity, power and responsibility, the constant tension between using wealth to insulate yourself from the world's problems, or engaging deeply with suffering you had resources to address. He wrote about her mother with love that hadn't dimmed despite years of separation, about his agony at not being able to be part of Clarissa's childhood, about his faith that the sacrifice would prove worthwhile when she eventually claimed an inheritance that came with character intact, rather than corrupted by growing up surrounded by wealth that could have twisted her values. I worry sometimes that I'm being selfish, one entry read, letting her grow up without the father every child deserves, because I believe the woman she'll become will be stronger for not having my money shape her from the beginning. But your mother insists this is right, that you need to understand the world most people experience before you can use resources to change it. I trust her judgment even when it breaks my heart to stay away. The words helped Clarissa understand choices that had shaped her life without her knowledge. Decisions made out of love rather than abandonment. Sacrifice rather than indifference. The meeting with Lenora had finally happened in a quiet cafe far from social circles where they might be observed and judged. Just two women navigating a complicated relationship that had been damaged perhaps beyond complete repair, but might find some functional equilibrium if both were willing to work toward it. Lenora looked smaller somehow, diminished by months of social exile and forced reflection. Her usual armor of impeccable grooming and cold confidence replaced by something more uncertain and possibly more genuine. I've been thinking about what happened, Lenora began without preamble, her directness suggesting she'd rehearsed this conversation and wanted to get through it before courage failed. About why I treated you the way I did, what it says about me that I was so threatened by your presence in Eric's life. She met Clarissa's eyes with difficulty, clearly unaccustomed to this level of honest self-examination. I've spent my entire life maintaining position and status, believing that was what mattered, that social standing defined worth and value. You represented a threat to that system because you came from outside it, because Eric choosing you suggested that maybe everything I'd prioritized wasn't actually important. So I tried to break you, to prove that breeding and background mattered more than character. The admission was raw, stripped of the usual social performance, and Clarissa recognized it as the kind of truth that cost something to speak. I was wrong, Lenora continued, her voice cracking slightly. Not just wrong about you specifically, though I was catastrophically wrong about that. Wrong about the whole framework I'd used to understand human value. These months of being excluded, of experiencing what I put you through, have taught me things I should have learned decades ago, but was too insulated by privilege to see. She paused, gathering herself. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. I'm asking for the chance to be in Eric's life, and by extension yours, if you allow it, in ways that don't repeat the mistakes I made. I want to be better than I was, though I understand if you don't trust that possibility enough to risk giving me the opportunity to fail again. Clarissa studied the woman who'd orchestrated such systematic cruelty, searching for evidence of genuine transformation versus performance designed to regain access to power and influence that her exile had cost. What she saw was complicated, mixing legitimate remorse with self-interest in ways that probably reflected most human motivation, the messy reality of people who were capable of both cruelty and growth, whose worst moments didn't necessarily define their entire character, if they were willing to learn from consequences and change. "I'll give you a chance," Clarissa said finally, watching relief flood Lenora's face. "But understand clearly that this is conditional on behavior, not promises. You're welcome at family dinners and holiday gatherings. You can rebuild your relationship with Eric under my observation. But the first time you dismiss someone for their background, the first comment that suggests you value people based on their social position rather than their character, you're done. No second chances beyond this one. No appeals or negotiations. You get to be part of our lives only as long as your actions match the transformation you're claiming." The terms were clear and non-negotiable. Boundaries established from position of strength rather than vulnerability, and Lenora accepted them with the understanding that she'd lost authority she would never fully regain, that the balance of power had shifted permanently, and her only path forward involved genuine humility rather than performed deference. Eric's transformation had been slower, but perhaps more substantial. The dismantling of assumed privilege and examination of values he'd never questioned, requiring months of uncomfortable self-reflection and behavioral changes that didn't come naturally to someone raised in comfort and insulation. He'd started volunteering at foundation programs, spending time with people whose lives bore no resemblance to his own privileged existence, learning lessons about resilience and dignity that wealth had protected him from understanding. "I met a woman today at the job training program," he told Clarissa one evening, his voice carrying wonder that suggested genuine revelation rather than performative empathy. "She's been homeless, addicted, incarcerated, everything society teaches us to judge and dismiss. But she's fighting every day to build something better, working 2 jobs while attending classes, supporting kids who depend on her, not giving up. Her strength and determination put my comfortable life to shame." He shook his head, processing experiences that were reshaping his understanding of human worth and capacity. "I've been so focused on surface things, status and appearance, and what people think, that I missed everything that actually matters. You tried to show me that, and I couldn't see it until consequences forced me to look." The growth was real if incomplete. Eric becoming someone Clarissa could imagine building genuine partnership with if they both continued working toward it, though she remained cautious about trusting transformation that circumstances had forced rather than character had chosen independently. Vanessa had disappeared from their lives completely, her banishment absolute and apparently accepted without protest. Clarissa heard through social channels that she'd left New York entirely, relocating to Paris, where Theodore Stanton's name carried less weight, and her past mistakes might not define her completely. The news brought neither satisfaction nor regret, just recognition that some situations couldn't be fixed or forgiven, that boundaries sometimes required complete separation rather than a managed relationship. As spring arrived and snow melted to reveal the city beneath, Clarissa stood once again in the Van Halen Mansion's Grand Hall, where she'd endured such systematic humiliation months earlier. But now the space felt entirely different, transformed not by physical changes, but by a shift in authority and purpose that redefined every corner. She was hosting a reception for foundation grant recipients, filling these gilded rooms with people who'd been lifted by programs Theodore had funded and she now guided, their stories of transformation and perseverance far more valuable than any display of inherited wealth or social position. Children from Detroit who'd overcome poverty to earn scholarships played near the fireplace, where Lenora had once held court dispensing judgment. Formerly incarcerated individuals who'd rebuilt their lives through job training programs conversed with board members about challenges and solutions with expertise earned through lived experience rather than academic study. And threading through it all was recognition that this mansion now served purposes beyond displaying privilege, that rooms which had witnessed cruelty were being redeemed through hospitality that valued human dignity regardless of circumstances. Eric stood beside her, present and supportive in ways he'd failed to be during those dark months, his hand resting gently on her back in a gesture that claimed her publicly as his wife and his priority. Lenora circulated carefully, speaking with guests with respect that seemed genuine if still developing, working to prove she understood how completely her worldview needed to change. And Clarissa felt her mother's presence like warmth surrounding her. That gentle woman who taught patience and integrity during modest years, preparing her daughter for exactly this moment. This opportunity to wield power with grace and use wealth to lift others rather than pressing them down. The gold necklace rested against her collarbone, connecting her to the father who'd loved from a distance and trusted her mother's wisdom about how to raise a daughter who would someday inherit everything while remaining uncorrupted by everything. Snow had fallen that Christmas Eve, covering Manhattan in white silence, while inside a woman was broken down by people who thought they knew her worth. But snow always melted eventually, revealing ground beneath that proved more fertile than anyone had imagined, ready for seeds that would grow into something extraordinary. Some truths didn't explode with immediate drama. They waited patiently, gathering strength in silence, preparing for the moment when revelation would reshape everything. Clarissa had endured humiliation that should have destroyed her, but instead had refined her, had suffered betrayals that could have made her bitter, but had made her wise, had discovered power she could have used for vengeance, but chose to wield with strategic mercy that proved more impressive than any revenge. She was Theodore Stanton's daughter, inheritor of wealth beyond measure and responsibility to match. But more than that, she was her mother's daughter, carrier of values that money couldn't buy and privilege couldn't teach, living proof that character formed in adversity could guide resources toward purposes that honored human dignity and transformed lives. The party continued around her, voices rising in, laughter and conversation, the sound of people from every background finding common ground in shared humanity that wealth and poverty couldn't divide if leadership refused to let those divisions matter. And somewhere in the evening's warmth and light, the ghost of a humble seamstress smiled at what her daughter had become, while the spirit of a distant father finally rested in peace, knowing his sacrifice had been worthwhile, his trust had been warranted, and his legacy was in hands strong enough to carry it forward into future generations who would benefit from one woman's patience, one family's love, and one terrible evening that revealed truth and distributed justice in ways that changed everything forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel